was found. At least, nothing was found for 9 months. Until in June of 2015, a hiker discovered the backpack of Aaron Hedges. Inside of this backpack, the hiker discovered a cell phone, a hunting vest, extra clothes, a hunting license, and several granola bar wrappers, all of which belonging to Aaron Hedges. However, a short distance from that backpack, and potentially the weirdest development of the whole case, the hiker found sitting on top of a rock a thermos and an open energy drink. The family later saying that this thermos belonged to Aaron. This location was on top of the mountain that not only had a very clear view of the ranch beneath, but also of a major roadway right in front of the ranch. And it seems that when Aaron was drinking from that thermos and the energy drink, he was just sitting on the rock watching the road and the farm in front of him. And despite another massive investigation from the spot that this gear was found, no remains were located. That was until 1 year later when the skeletal remains of Aaron Hedges were finally discovered. They were lying about half a mile down the hillside from the location where his gear was found the year prior. This was about 6 miles from where the makeshift campfire and boots were discovered, and about 15 miles from the last place where his friends saw him. And to make it even more bizarre, the remains were found a few hundred feet from the road and the ranch. And just in case you thought we'd get any answers, there were no cause of death determined from the bones that were found. Gear was found. There was no trauma on any of the bones or any indications of an injury that could have led to his death. For all we know, he simply died there with no earthly explanation. So think about this case. An experienced hiker begins to walk to a location that he's incredibly familiar with. However, he walks the completely wrong direction and then comes back in the wrong direction before he decides to take his boots off, walk another 6 miles to a mountaintop where he calmly sits down and has a coffee and energy drink before he leaves his backpack. And it seems that he was not only energized from the drinks, but also the granola wrappers he was eating, walks half a mile, and dies right before he hits the road. A lot of people online say that he passed into a different dimension, which, sure, I've got nothing better. It's a story that really makes you ask, what happens in the woods when we're not looking?
Some other cases I want to mention that they didn't really exemplify any of these individual profile points, but I thought that they were interesting.
From the drinks
were those of Maurice Metz, who went missing while topaz hunting in Pike National Forest. He was there with his friend, and this is another case where this was a person who was physically disabled. He had a very time walking on his own. He was, I believe, 82 years old, so there just wasn't any way that he was really going anywhere fast. His friend, after a few hours, went to check on him because they were just topaz hunting 50 yards from each other, and he checked on him a few times, but the last time he went to check, Maurice wasn't there anymore, and nobody at all could find him. There's no way this guy wandered off on his own, and they determined there was no motive for the guy who was with him to have killed him. So, very strange case. There's the case of Eric Lewis, who went missing while hiking, particularly climbing Mount Rainier. They were ice climbing. He and his 2 friends, they noticed that they hadn't heard anything from him in a while, and when they pulled on the rope that would have gone down to him, it was slack. Eric seemingly just disappeared off the side of the mountain. He had unhooked his carabiner, and that was the last thing anybody could figure out that he had actually done. His clothes and gear were found in a small ice cave a little bit down the mountain, and that was it. That was the end. They could not find him, and the ice cave either did not go back far enough or was not navigable enough for them to look into it. There's also the case of Paul LeMay, who went missing on Mount Marathon. Now, Mount Marathon is, of course, in Kenai Fjords National Park, so he was running the Mount Marathon race. He was the last person to be running the race. He was seen very close to the finish line by the crew who were packing up. He decided he wanted to make it all the way and then come back down, and he was never seen. They searched all over the mountain, every side, and there was no evidence that he had ever left the peak. Finally, the case of Bart Schleier, who went missing in Reed's Lake in the Yukon Territory. This was not in a national park or national forest, but it was in an extremely isolated area that you actually had to fly to. He was brought in via an amphibious plane, and then when the pilot returned to pick him up at the scheduled time, Bart was not there. There was no sign that he had actually been hurt or attacked while he was there, but he just disappeared. His food was still all packed up at the campsite. There was a bag that had an impression on it that made it look like somebody might have been sitting on it, leaning back, maybe waiting for game to come along. And of course, Bart was a world-class hunter. This is a guy who would track and tag Siberian tigers. And I mean, the idea that a bear in the Yukon would catch him off guard enough to kill him without any sign of struggle just doesn't make sense. On top of that, if it were a bear, a mountain lion, a pack of wolves, anything like that, they probably would have also gone for the food that was left at his campsite. Since that was untouched, it seems very unlikely that he was a victim of animal predation. So that just about covers all the profile points and a number of cases that exemplify them. Once again, I'm Aiden Mattis of the Lore Lodge. You can find us here on YouTube, and I'll toss it back to Isaiah to go over some more details.
A lot of the missing 411 cases are entirely unexplainable, not only because of the condition in which remains or some evidence was eventually found, but just in the way that the entire thing kicked off. And I want to end this set of stories with one such case, that case being of Garrett Bardsley. On August the 20th of 2004, Garrett was out with his father on a Boy Scouts camping trip. Garrett was 12 years old and was out with his father and Boy Scout troop on a weekend getaway. This was in the Uinta Mountains of Utah at a place known as Cubaret One Lake. Now, in several of the cases that Aiden and I have talked about up until this point, it involves an experienced person going into an uncharted realm of nature or someone getting trapped in the harsh elements. However, this situation was neither of those things. The location where Garrett and his father were camping was essentially a sort of park. There were several lots that were set up where groups could come and pitch a few tents and have access to hiking trails and lakes to fish in, and everything was very close and very easy going. Again, it was a common space to bring out campers so that they can have their first Boy Scout camping trip. All the trails were cut out and very clearly marked to the point it was essentially a sidewalk. And on top of all of that, Garrett had his wilderness survival training. So if anything did happen out here, it should essentially be a cakewalk. Garrett and his father walked to the lake that was just downhill from their camping spot. While they were fishing, Garrett slipped and fell into the water, soaking his pants and shoes. Garrett decided to walk back to the tent so that he could change, and then he told his father he would come back down in just a minute to continue fishing. His father didn't think anything of it, because not only, as I mentioned, were the trails clearly marked and it was all a very easy path to walk on, but the campsite was about 200 feet away from where they were currently fishing. If it wasn't for a little bit of tree cover, you could have a straight line of sight from the side of the bank to the campsite. The dad, being overly cautious, even directed his son as his son was walking away to stay on the marked path and followed him with his eyes until he got up to the tree line. Meaning at the last point Garrett was seen, he could have been within like 50 feet of the tent. So Garrett's dad continued fishing, but after about 20 minutes, he thought it was odd that Garrett hadn't come back to join him. So his dad comes up to the campground to check, and it turns out that Garrett never made it back to the camp. And as a matter of fact, Garrett was never seen again, remains or otherwise. It seems in just a few brief seconds even, that Garrett was walking through the tree line, something took him off the trail. Either his own curiosity or something in the woods or something by force got him to leave the clear path he was following. A massive search was mounted, and the only evidence of Garrett that was ever found was about half a mile off the trail in a granite boulder patch. One of his wet socks was discovered, simply lying there crumbled up in a massive field of rocks. Even from the location where the sock was found, the main road was a quarter mile away, and there were so many campsites and roads all around the area, it's almost as if Garrett, or whatever had Garrett, was purposefully avoiding people. And despite efforts from search and rescue, dog teams, and horseback riders searching the area, nothing was ever found, not even the fishing pole that Garrett took with him. And to this day, nothing more is known of what happened to Garrett Bardsley, save for one lonely sock. With several of these 411 cases, it boggles the mind to even try to come up with some explanation. Of course, that doesn't mean everything that's labeled as a 411 case is completely unexplainable. A point could be made for several of these cases that it was just someone out hiking who got too far in over their head, or someone who just got lost and then nature does what nature does. However, that doesn't explain some of the weird circumstances or some of the gear found or how the remains were uncovered. Another theory is that people say it could be a serial killer, or the police covering up for some murder they don't want on the public record. But even then, in a lot of these cases, like that of Aaron Hedges, even if he was killed, then how did that person leave all the gear, evade search and rescue team, and get the remains in the places they were found? People tie a lot of these theories into government conspiracies and say that it all relates back to MK Ultra. With a lot of these stories, people say that maybe the government has these top secret facilities set up in the middle of the woods, and if anyone finds evidence of it, they're wiped out and their body made to look like a mystery. And while that sounds crazy, with some of the stories you've probably heard today and will hear in the future, it's probably the most plausible. Perhaps some of the most interesting stories to me are stories of delirium and paranoia that sets in. Because while we can wrap our head around that in a physical sense, we understand that people can essentially go crazy. It's the things that made them go crazy and the reason for it that I find to be so enthralling. Because what power does the forest hold to drive a mind mad in such a small amount of time? Of course, several of the cases could be written off as the effects of a wild animal attacking someone or either discarding their pieces across a large distance. But that doesn't answer questions like the bones of Charles being found in his own socks. But then again, at that point, what does? If it's not a creature we know exists, what of one that we don't know exists? Whenever I hear about these stories, I often think about a lot of the ancient legends that have to do with the Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Mountains. Stories of siren spirits that exist out in the woods that pull men into them only to never be seen again. And stories of creatures that rise up in the night and make men vanish from their tents, only to be found horribly mutilated several days later. And while it may not be some siren spirit or monster of the woods, whatever did it then is surely still doing it now. Things like that are easy for me to forget because I grew up in the forest. It's always been something that I viewed as a friend or something personal to me that I've never really found scary, at least, during the daytime. And since it's something I've always known, it's never been the unknown. And because of that, and since the unknown is where we derive most of our fear, it's never been something I've been afraid of. And because of that, it's easy for me to forget that there is this secret might and power that exists within the woods. Every single piece of it is alive, from the trees and the grass and the creatures that inhabit them to even the air you breathe in. It feels electric. It's as if every moment that you stand within nature, you are existing within a living creature. And if you ever lose sight or respect of that, you may be the next victim. That's really what it boils down to, right? The fear of the unknown. That's why these stories terrify us and keep us up at night, because they seem to be so unexplainable. And as someone who's familiar with the mystique and the mystery of the forest, I never want to lose sight of why it's so alluring in the first place. And that's one of the reasons that I'm here right now. A few of you may be wondering why I've had a change of venue. And that's because I'm at the ocean. If you're familiar with my channel, you know I'm deathly terrified of the ocean and everything to do with it, so to make it even worse for myself, I came out here at night and I'm not doing well. The reason that I came out here is because for me, the woods and the mysteries of the woods and everything associated with them don't really mean anything. The tide is coming up to my legs, okay. Because again, I was raised in it. To me, it's perfectly normal. However, something I am terrified of is the nature I don't know. See, I was never raised near the beach. I only came to the beach on vacation. To me, the ocean was a boogeyman I never interacted with, and it still is to some degree. But it's for that very reason that the ocean interests me as much as it does. Because in spite of how afraid I am of it, and in spite how terrifying of it, it exists regardless. And it's so interesting to me, the terrors and the fascination that I can pull out of it. And in a sense, the ocean and the woods are one. It's all part of nature. It's all part of this great big beast that we're all living in, and we can't really explain, or we can't really... I swear I heard something run up. Oh man. It's all part of something we can't wrap our heads around, and it exists in spite of how we feel about it. The reason I'm here is because as I go through this series and as I talk about Missing 411, I don't want to lose the terror or the majesty of these stories and why I feel they're so important. Because they're a blemish across our history of trying to figure out everything that we can't put together, and that blemish is nature itself. So if you're like me and the woods don't scare you, but this does, it's all part of the same beast. So as hopefully over the coming series we put some pieces together about what the secret of missing 411 means, maybe we can get some closure on things like this. Probably not. I hate it and I'm incredibly nervous right now. But if you made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you for watching. I am horrified right now. I think I'm actually here past curfew, and I'm not supposed to be here, and I keep hearing people walking around in the darkness, so I'm going to call this short. But I just want to say thank you so much for watching. Thank you all so much for checking this out. Thank you so much to Aiden for being a part of the video. Aiden's a fantastic guy. As I mentioned, his channel will be in the description, along with the podcast him and I do together about weird biblical topics. So if you like my weird biblical stuff, be sure to check us out over there, and check out Aiden's channel regardless. He's a great guy, and I really like what he's doing on the Lore Lodge. So that covers that. I will be continuing this. What I have in mind for upcoming episodes in the series is to take cases that involve caves, or to take cases that involve mountaintops and other weird anomalies. Other weird anomalies that exist between everything, and then trying to draw a through line between them. So we'll see how that goes. And again, this was mostly an introduction, but hopefully you enjoyed it. I'm excited for where this series is going, and keep your eye out. I may be visiting some locations, considering, as mentioned earlier, I live pretty close to a lot of the scares that happen. So we'll see how that goes. But for now, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! This is horrific.
Killed a 17-year-old boy with a revolver.
WXLT TV, Channel 40, Sarasota, Bradenton. Preview guide.
Lost media is a topic that I have been enamored by for years, yet have surprisingly not formally gotten into. The thought of disturbing TV broadcasts, audio, and VHS footage that have been lost to time is fascinating, and the links that people go to find them is incredible. So much dark and disturbing content has existed even before the internet, and the aim of this series is to dive into them, their search, and their stories, because, as it turns out, some of the darkest lost media out there seems to have always existed among us.
The following is a presentation of the Christian Television Network.
And join us for a half hour of fun and games at Joy Junction. Now here's Sheriff Don.
Hi, how you doing? Good to see you.
1980. A show is broadcasting on the Christian Television Network named Joy Junction. It's textbook public access TV, set at the eponymous village and hosted by the town sheriff. Throughout the show's lifespan, the town residents would join in for educational bits about the Bible, and kids were encouraged to take part in various games. It seemed to have been pretty successful during its time, as it was on the air for a few years. Bizarrely, nearly every record and archive of this show ever existing have been wiped though, merely leaving us with a handful of surviving re-uploads on YouTube. This has, admittedly, made it difficult to find any further information about Joy Junction aside from what we can distill from the existing footage. But that's okay, because that's not the main reason we're here anyway.
Hi, everybody. What's happening?
Hey, Ron, good to see you.
Oh, and I've been waiting and waiting and waiting on you. Oh, I'm sorry I got tied up, Marty, but traffic was heavy and the stores were busy. You know how it is when you go shopping.
One of the show's cast members was a ventriloquist by the name of Ron, and he was present in nearly every episode, joined by his doll Marty.
Well, they're going to come back. Well, I did come back, didn't I? Yeah. I told you I would come back, didn't I? Yeah. And I'm sorry.
Typically, they'd have a quick conversation about whatever the topic of the day was, and it, at least in the surviving archives, appeared to serve as a bridge between two segments of the show. Ron's full name was Ronald Brown, and in the years following the show's eventual end, he'd launch his own puppeteering company out of Florida called Puppets Plus. On his website at puppetsplus.com, we can observe a myriad of their clients, along with the age groups that he was primarily hired for. Ages 2 to 5, and 6 to 11. Now, at first glance, this seems par for the course in his profession. Children's entertainment was his forte. However, it's when we back up and take a look at Ronald as a person when things begin to sour. You see, throughout the years, Ronald had a strange dynamic with children. For instance, in 1998, he was pulled over for a traffic violation and was found to be in possession of boys' underwear. His excuse was that he used them for his puppets, and he was eventually let off. Other complaints came throughout the 2000s about him giving rides to kids in his church van. Unfortunately, police could never do much because there wasn't any explicit crime being committed. It was incredibly strange, but unfortunately not enough to warrant any sort of arrest. Where things really get nutty though is when we jump to the early 2010s, in which Brown would find himself caught in a web of controversy. In May of 2012, a man named Michael Arnett was arrested after a sting operation. He was charged with the production of, and upon searching his home and computer, they would find chat logs on Yahoo Messenger between he and a person going by the name U.E. Lime. As it turned out, Arnett would produce these images and distribute them to various others online from the username CK3666, Sweet Talker Linda, and Calf Keeper 2. You'll notice that U.E. Lime was outward about their desires. They expressed interest in cannibalism, torture, sexual assault, and all of it was directed towards children, even as young as 2. The catch here, though, is that U.E. Lime wasn't just a random person. It was Ronald Brown, his secret online alias in which he'd express his fantasy about the kids he surrounded himself with daily. Let me remind you that this was a man whose entire career, entire life, was centered around associating with kids. Someone who was, at one point, on television in front of thousands. To say that these chat logs were a bad look would be putting it lightly. And yes, the messages you're seeing are straight out of the official case file. After corresponding with Yahoo.com, authorities were able to track down Ronald Brown and tie his username to a profile on a necrophilia website named cutedeadguys.net. Ronald's profile has been lost to time. However, through his own case report, we're able to find details describing it. On this site, his bio read, "I love them young and dead. I enjoy them fresh, but like to see them displayed in their casket too." And a few snippets from his post history. "I like the blonde boy. Would love to snuff him. Very hot pics. That boy looks dead. I like that one. I'd love to kill them." It's safe to say that at this point, there was more than enough to warrant an arrest. And on July 19th of 2012, that notion would finally become a reality.
Federal marshals arrested a Largo man for possessing and conspiring to kidnap a child. They say he was a puppeteer who performed for children in the Bay Area. News Channel 8's Yolanda Fernandez has been following this story for us. She is joining us live tonight from Pinellas County.
Well, Keith, 57-year-old Ron Brown is here in the Pinellas County Jail tonight. Federal investigators say it was his gruesome and very graphic online chats with the
Brown's house was raided, and scattered across his home were images of pictures of kids being tied up, and even some that appeared to be dead. Furthermore, agents found CDs with much of the same material, a blow-up sex doll dressed in boys' clothes, a journal he kept about his fantasies dating back to 1978, and even books about serial killers and cannibalism. He was eventually found guilty of possession of and was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison with a lifetime of supervision thereafter. Had he lived out his full sentence, he would be out sometime in 2033. However, as of August of 2020, it's reported that he is now deceased. My heart goes out to the children who had to suffer for the pleasure of this monster and all of those who associated with him. For his entire life, he was calculated and knew what he was doing. His career, his church van favors, his company parties, all a front for some of the darkest desires imaginable. In hindsight, I understand why Joy Junction's records were wiped. It was a show with a good premise and good intentions, I won't deny that. However, now bears a reputation forever stained by the devil, hidden within them. Before we continue, just a couple quick announcements. First off, I'd like to formally announce my second channel, called Nexpo After Hours. Here, I aim to bring you guys analytical videos about smaller web series and horror video games. Currently, I have an upload about a smaller creepy web series, and I'll be dropping the next one in about 5 minutes from now. So if you're into that sort of thing, I welcome you with open arms. It's a big creative outlet for me, and we're gonna have some fun. If you're not, however, no sweat. We still got the big projects on main. Second, new merch is now available at crowdmade.com/collection/nexpo. We've got some super cool new designs if you're interested. Link in the description. Lastly, if you're interested in gaining early access to videos, script files, and work-in-progress cuts of upcoming projects, your support would mean the world to me over at patreon.com/nexpo. Of course, it's never expected, but always appreciated as I try to keep these videos sponsor-free. is 1928, and a romantic disaster film about Noah's Ark hits theaters. Directed by a man named Michael Curtiz, it premieres during a transitional period between silent movies and talkies, or films with actual spoken dialogue. Because of this, it's mostly regarded as a hybrid film with long scenes being played over music, and with it comes a healthy dose of extensive criticism. Most of the backlash is due to its runtime, clocking in at a whopping 2 hours and 15 minutes long, with considerable portions containing awkward dialogue and drawn-out scenes. Sitting through this movie is, to put it lightly, a considerable undertaking. Because of this, the film is pulled for revision, and the cut content is never shown again. A good portion of the cut footage came from what the movie is mostly known for today, and that's the flood scene. In it, we can observe a slew of actors fighting their way out of a crumbling temple and towards the Ark to stay alive. It's a grandiose set with a lot going on, and keeping in mind the time period, all of this was pulled off with practical effects. These people were, legitimately, submerged. Some might consider the acting here to be pretty well done. Like I said, this scene is grand, and due to the time period, was all pulled off practically. The thing is, some of these actors weren't actually acting, as during this scene, 3 actors drowned and 1 reportedly lost their leg. This was the result of over 600,000 gallons of water being dumped across the set, something that the film's extras were reportedly unaware of. It's been reported that, before filming commenced, Michael Curtiz was warned against putting so many people in danger. However, he shrugged it off, claiming that the extras were expected to be prepared for anything, and that, quote, they're just gonna have to take their chances. In the original cut of the movie, it's rumored that you could see these deaths happen on screen with a much more fleshed out flood scene. However, since the revisions, that original version is forever considered lost. It's rumored that Curtiz was in pursuit of relentless perfection. He wanted this movie to be grand and authentic. However, in this chase came a loss of life that did not need to happen, leaving Noah's Ark forever stained with an enduring legacy of tragedy.
Searching for a website, a window to the world, got to get online. Take a spin, now you're in with the techno set. You're going surfing on the internet.
On the 2nd of July 2014, an ad was made on Craigslist. It came from an 18-year-old girl named Brooke Slocum and was but a simple request for cash.
I need $50 by 3:30 p.m. today. I can pay you back later tonight, but I need gas and some mess quick. Everyone has bronchitis at my house and I do not want to get sick. I'm 8 months pregnant and my lungs are all squished as is. If you could help, me and my daughter will greatly appreciate it.
This post remained untouched for 10 days. At 10:08 p.m. on the night of July 12th, Slocum receives an email from a man going by the name Mike's Hard. I can host, what are you thinking? I'm 25. This was a reply to other, separate ads that Brooke made around the same time period, in which she would solicit sex for money. According to her friends, it wasn't willingly, as her then boyfriend, 25-year-old Charles Oppenheer would coerce her to do this while accompanying her during these meetups. Reluctant, Slocum responds 20 minutes later.
Well, we're looking for donations if possible. Kinda in a tight spot, and we have a baby on the way. As far as the fund goes, though, there won't be any mail.
How does $120 sound? I can drive you over here if you need.
No, we can travel, just can't host is all. When and where would you like to meet up?
I like to f*** outside in a park around 11:30. That okay?
I don't know. I don't want to get in trouble for indecent exposure or anything. I can't go to jail being 8 months pregnant.
It's cop-free. It's a park, but behind it there are lots of woods. No cops at all. This last email arrived at 10:59 p.m., and as we can see, Mike's Hard was keen on meeting that same night. Needless to say, Slocum ended up accepting, and their trip to Kazan Park in Wyoming, Michigan was on. It's midnight. The couple arrives, with Mike pulling up shortly after. Initially believing this to be another sex meetup, the two approach Mike without much concern. Sometime during the next few minutes, Brooke is grabbed, bound, and shoved into the trunk of Mike's car. In haste, Charles tries to help, however is unsuccessful, resulting in a violent altercation between the two. It's unclear how long this fight lasted. However, what is certain is that during this, Charles was violently killed. Mike drags his body near the woods, saws his head off, and covers the remains with sticks. And without so much of a single witness, he jumps in his car and, alongside Charles' head and Brooke Slocum stowed behind him, drives off into the night. After realizing that Oppenheer's car had not moved in days, police began probing on his whereabouts. When asked, his parents drummed up nothing, his work nothing. No one knew where he was, but his car was there. And so they began searching the park on July 17th, 5 days after the incident with Mike's Hard. Upon scouring the wooded area that lined its back end, they then discover a headless body under some brush. And it was later identified as Charles Oppenheer. In the coming hours, it was realized that Oppenheer wasn't single, and his girlfriend, too, was missing. In haste, authorities obtained a search warrant for her apartment and began searching her laptop. On it, there were a myriad of conversations. However, one thread from Mike's Hard stood out among the rest. The Internet Crimes Against Children Unit was called in for analysis on the real name behind the alias, and they found that this address was tied to another email which was tied to a Facebook for a man not named Mike, but Brady Ostrike. They stake out near his home while they await a search warrant. There wasn't enough evidence for an arrest warrant by this point, so that was a frustrating roadblock. The hours tick by without much happening. However, around 9 p.m. on the night of July 17th, Brady would be spotted jumping into his car and leaving his home. A few moments later, he's stopped by a nearby officer. Before they could get to him, though, he takes off, leading to a grueling pursuit. Eventually, he loses control and crashes into a cement barrier. As the officers pull up for apprehension, however, he shoots in the head and falls forth to his death. A few seconds later, police approach and search his vehicle. In it was 31-year-old Brady Ostrike, dead in the front seat. And in the trunk, stuffed within a suitcase, was 18-year-old Brooke Slocum and her unborn daughter, both of whom were deceased. Upon searching Ostrike's home shortly after, they discovered a plethora of ropes, knives, swords, cages, straps, and bizarre writings that make little to no sense at all. His toilet was inoperable, and the entire place was nothing short of rancid. Most interesting of all, however, was the discovery of cameras. As it turned out, he had them all over his home so he could document his actions. And what you're seeing here is Ostrike as he prepares the basement he kept Slocum in for those agonizing 5 days. Now, there exists footage of Brady Ostrike's grueling torture of Brooke Slocum. However, you'll never see it. The police department has gone on record to say that they will never release it, however describe it as something straight out of a nightmare. During the time Slocum was captive, and even when police were right outside the home, she was locked in handcuffs with a chain around her neck. Reportedly, Ostrike had bound her arms to the ropes hanging from the ceiling and left her dangling while he sexually assaulted and tortured her before strangling her to death. All of this was captured on film. Years later, Oppenier's head was found off some back roads, 17 miles north of Gizon Park. It's a chilling end to a disturbing online saga and really drives home the fact that you really don't know who it is you're meeting with on Craigslist, dating apps, OfferUp, what have you, until you actually come face to face. What began as a simple request for just $50 had led to the loss of 3 lives following a days-long nightmare orchestrated by a depraved man. The torture footage is, as of 2022, considered indefinite lost media that may never see the light of day. However, considering what exactly it entails, I don't think we'd really want it to.
Coast is the one, Coast Federal.
Win Armstrong
for Coast Federal.
WXLT TV, Channel 40, Sarasota, Bradenton.
We're with you on ABC Review.
The year is 1972, and a reporter named Christine Chubbuck eagerly lands a job at WXLT Channel 40 in Sarasota, Florida. Initially hired as a reporter, she was reassigned to a spot named Suncoast Digest, a local affairs segment that ran at 9 a.m. every Saturday. During her time there, she'd become attracted to a fellow reporter named George Ryan and would seek his attention by baking him cakes and expressing a desire to hang out. When she realized that he was already romantically involved with another coworker, however, it was detrimental to her self-image, as Christine historically had difficulty finding love. According to her family, she'd go on dates with various men throughout the years, however had trouble connecting socially with them. On top of this, by 1973, Chubbuck underwent surgery to have one of her ovaries removed, and as a result, her doctors began to pressure her, claiming that if she wasn't able to conceive within 2 to 3 years thereafter, she may never be able to.
The
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Super spy Fred Flintstone is off on the trail of the mysterious Green Goose, a master of
Tonight we begin with the death of a man armed with scissors. He was shot by police 24 times.
Do something, get him to do something about the problem. Meantime, they say they're going to back the leafleting up with a meeting this Friday with city and state officials.
Good evening. More than 100 people were reported dead in a plane crash near New York's Kennedy Airport this afternoon. The plane was an Eastern Airlines 727 nearing the end of a...
As 1974 approached, Chibuk witnessed a shift in news methodology. Christine always had a desire to pursue what she believed to be high-impact stories about issues affecting the community. However, WXLT executives were leaning more towards stories that were juicier, per se, utilizing fear and sensationalism to drive viewership, in turn generating revenue. The news she was tasked with reporting began to shift further and further towards spectacle and shock, and she frequently rallied against this to no avail. Resultingly, she became stuck in a mindset, in a world that she was growing to hate. Her professional life, her personal life, everything around her.
Good evening, I'm Steve Newman, and this is Channel 40 Weather Watch. It's going to be even cooler tonight than tomorrow night than tonight. The reason for this, with the passage of the cold front today, when we picked up some showers, skies have cleared very nicely. And as a result...
On the 15th of July, 1974, Christine enthusiastically entered the station. Instead of opening Suncoast Digest traditionally, however, she claimed that there was a newscast she had to read to open it, something that hadn't been done hitherto. She takes her seat at the news desk, and for the first 8 minutes, opens her segment about 3 national news stories and a shooting that took place the day prior. Following this, a film reel of the shooting was supposed to play, but had jammed, leaving a few moments of dead air. In response, Christine apologized for the error before taking out a script she had handwritten and reading to the viewers the following.
Adding substantially to those statistics. This weekend, being typical of the recent rash of violence, saw one man stabbed, another assaulted, and a third shot and wounded. Sarasota police report the finding of an 18-year-old, a man by the name of David Wynn, in the parking lot of a Friendly Tavern on 27th Street. Wynn had an apparent stab wound in the chest, which, according to witnesses, was inflicted by James Whitworth during a fight. Police charged Whitworth with aggravated assault. Wynn is in satisfactory condition at Sarasota Memorial Hospital. The second attempted armed robbery in a week has involved law enforcement officers from both Sarasota and Manatee counties. Last week, teenage gunmen held up the highway bar and, after a shootout and high-speed automobile chase, held a family hostage and finally were nabbed by Sarasota Sheriff's deputies. Early Sunday morning, the Beef and Bottle restaurant north of Sarasota Bradenton Airport on US 41 was the site of an attempted armed robbery and shooting. TV40 newsman Bob Peterson was on the scene shortly after it began, and he filed this report. Sorry, for those of you who saw Late Night Weekend News Watch last night, we did have a film report and a commentary by Bob Peterson. Unfortunately, we had technical difficulties and cannot bring it to you now. However, News Watch tonight at 5:30, and we will have that story for you then. As of this morning, Grace Foster, who was shot in that incident, is in satisfactory condition at Sarasota Memorial Hospital. In keeping with the WXLT practice of presenting the most immediate and complete reports of local blood and guts news, TV40 presents what is believed to be a television first. In living color, exclusive coverage of an attempted suicide.
At this moment, Christine drew a Smith & Wesson revolver that she had hidden in her bag, placed it behind her right ear, and fired. immediately falling forward onto her desk. In a frantic response, the tech directors quickly faded the broadcast to black and scrambled to play a movie thereafter. Calls began to flood in, with viewers questioning the authenticity of what they just witnessed, with some believing that this was just a morbid joke or a prank. However, it was far from it. She was rushed to Sarasota Hospital, and back at the station, the news director, Mike Simmons, had discovered 2 pages of a script left behind by her. The first page contained what we heard prior, however the second was a follow-up intended to be read by a third party. Today, Christine Chibuk during a live broadcast. She was rushed to Sarasota Memorial Hospital where she remains in critical condition. Surprisingly, Christine's prediction turned out to be correct, not only because she was at that very hospital, but because she remained in critical condition for 14 hours until her eventual death. Christine's body was cremated and spread in the Gulf of Mexico, marking the end of a life full of despair. To those around her and to her loved ones, however, an agonizing void was left that would forever go unfilled. Reportedly, only one tape of this incident existed and was kept by Bob Nelson, the station's owner. After his death, his wife Molly would inherit it before handing it over to a law firm for good. As of now, this is where it lies, and for the foreseeable future, may never see the light of day.
We will return after these messages.
Good morning.
To preface this last entry, I'd like to state from the outset that the following could be absolutely nothing. The answer could be completely mundane. However, the footage in this section has personally stood out to me because of how bizarrely out of place it is and how little info there is about it. I was gonna put it in the next disturbing things. However, I think it fits better here. Let us begin. It's the 1980s. Beetlejuice makes its debut. Journey, Survivor, Guns N' Roses, and our favorite Rick Astley are on the airwaves. And over on a stand-up comedy show named An Evening at the Improv, a child actor turned musician named Corey Feldman is world premiering his latest track, Something in Your Eyes.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start the show off tonight a bit differently than usual. What I'm going to do is I'm going to world premiere my song that I just finished writing and producing with Michael Damian for my new movie, Dream a Little Dream, with Jason Robards. It's called Something in Your Eyes. I'm going to do it right now.
As we can see, he had a mixed reaction from the audience. Clearly lip-syncing and taking inspiration from Michael Jackson, he employs dance moves in a musical style that attempts to emulate them. Upon looking through comments about him on YouTube, it's clear that history hasn't exactly been kind to Feldman. But that's beside the point. The reason I bring this video up in the first place is because, towards the song's end, Feldman's producer makes an incredibly strange cutaway to something that is very out of place for a video like this. Have a look.
You shouldn't have let it go. You should have held on. Stop running away.
What is this? And why is it here? Nowhere in this song does Feldman make any sort of mention about a woman being bound to a pool table. And after performing a cursory scan of his other music videos, cutaways like this never happen again. This seems eerily out of place, and discussion about this is painstakingly few and far between. The only mentions I could find about it were from Reddit and a few YouTube comments. However, none of them garnered much attention, and their sources are pretty much non-existent. With that being said, let's circle back to the footage so we can break it down ourselves. As we can see, the video of this woman was patched in post-production. Unlike the other cutaways that happened prior, this one has a different border. It's in black and white, and seems to be slightly lower quality than his music video. In the footage, we have a woman with brown or black hair tied up on each corner of the pool table, is in what appears to be a small room with a swinging light above her, and seems to be moving because of discomfort. To me, this footage could be one of three things. Either it's a scene from an obscure movie, a cut of a film, or it could be from a legitimate film. Personally, I believe it's one of the first two, given how obvious this cutaway is on something that's been seen by hundreds, if not thousands of people. If this were truly as sinister as it's been rumored, it would be a pretty stupid move to put it there. Regardless, this cutaway is one of the weirdest edits I have ever seen, and I'm still struggling to drum up a reason as to why it's there in the first place. I'm curious if you know anything about this, if you've seen it before, if you've heard about it, anything. This is a weird little mystery, and this is where I'm calling for your help. Who is the woman on the table? Even apart from the internet, the world is dark. So many pieces of media have been forgotten and lost to time, and in this series, I aim to document and bring those back to light. Thank you so much for joining me in this first installment of The Darkest Lost Media. I truly appreciate each and every one of you for taking the time out of your day to watch my videos, and I truly apologize for the delay on this one. I had to completely rework a section due to copyright issues, so it set me back pretty badly. Nonetheless, I really hope you guys like this. I made this series with the goal of it standing toe-to-toe with disturbing things in terms of quality, and I'm thrilled to keep this going if you would have me. That said, if you have any creepy suggestions for future installments for this series, and even disturbing things from around the internet, feel free to shoot me an email at dtfaisubmissions@gmail.com. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. I love you all. And good night.
Welcome back to Night Mind, friends. It's nice to be in the office again, isn't it? The weather is warm, the rain is that early summer variety, the mood is nice, the night is young, and I have something classic for you. That's right, new material, but old. How? You'll find out shortly. Before we begin, I know there's going to be a lot of activity and listening opportunities for you all summer long. And to that end, our friends at Raycon are here to sponsor this video and help kick off the season. If you're a constant Night Mind viewer, you'll already know how much I appreciate Raycon's everyday earbuds. And they look, feel, and sound better than ever, with their sleek design, variety of colors, and optimized gel tips, providing the perfect in-ear fit. Comfortable and compact, you can take your Raycon everyday earbuds with you wherever you go, and listen to them in the way that suits you best with 3 sound profiles to customize your experience. Hold the button on the left earbud for 3 seconds to choose between pure.
You can now order a Disturbance plush.
These are limited edition and the time is running out. Click the link in the description or pinned in the comments to purchase yours today. This case takes place in California in the year 1991. On the 23rd of April 1991, a woman enters a police station and hands them Polaroids containing images of a dead body. She explains that she had been driving through the Indio Desert in California and spotted something in a ditch. On closer inspection, she noticed it was a dead body, so she grabbed her Polaroid camera and took some photographs for proof. Police found the body belonging to a woman. She was completely naked apart from one shoe. Her clothing was thrown around near her body, as well as jewelry and hair extensions. It was clear that she had been violently attacked, but this was unlike anything the police had ever seen before. The mutilation of her corpse was sickening. She had been shot in the back of the head and then SA'd. After this, she was stabbed repeatedly in the neck, stomach, genitals, and rectum. Her nipples had been cut off as well as her ears, and finally, her eyes had been gouged out. As a final act of humiliation, the words "I love Jesus" had been carved into her back with a heart-shaped incision around the word love. Unfortunately, there was no identification with the body, so her identity was unknown until 2 days later, when it came to light that a woman had been reported missing by her daughter. The woman's name was Fatima Van, who was 38 years old. She had been driven there after attending community college by fellow student Philip Karl Jablonski. To understand how Jablonski got to the point of committing such heinous crimes, we need to go back to his first wife, Alice McGowan. The two of them had met in high school, but then Jablonski joined the military and was sent overseas. In 1968, he was posted in Texas, and Alice joined him. It is here where he became sexually violent. He would put a pillow over her face while having intercourse to try and suffocate her. Other times, he would grab her throat and strangle her until she passed out. The abuse continued to grow, and he tried to drown her in the bath when she said that she wanted to divorce him, and later strangled her while she was pregnant, only stopping because his mother had convinced him to. Alice would later leave him, and he soon became involved with a woman named Jane S., who he met in 1968. On their very first date, Jablonski committed an SA against her, although Jane did not report this, as she felt ashamed and embarrassed. The two of them remained in an abusive relationship together, and in 1969 she fell pregnant and they both moved to California. Their life was dominated by Jablonski's violence. One time during intercourse, Jane said that she wanted to stop, but instead, Jablonski pulled out a pistol and threatened to shoot her if they did not continue. He hit her with the base of the gun and knocked her unconscious. When she came back round, Jablonski was on top of her. He continued to be violent with her during intercourse and would repeatedly render her unconscious with a pillow. Her fear was actually being smothered and her child being left with Jablonski. In 1972, Jablonski in a rage threw a pan filled with scalding hot grease at her. Thankfully, it missed, and she hit him with the pan and knocked him out. She then grabbed her child and ran away. A few months after this, in 1972, another incident occurred. Jablonski was working at a company that trained guard dogs. Jablonski was sent to deliver some dogs to a woman named Marcia and her husband. He taught the couple how to handle the dogs and gave advice on their care. Late in the evening, on the 17th of December 1972, Jablonski returned to the residence to discuss some of the issues with Marcia about one of the dogs. During this time, her husband was at work. Jablonski assured Marcia that there was nothing to worry about and asked her to go upstairs to her bedroom and watch from the window as he cared for the dog outside. Marcia did as he requested. She went upstairs entered her bedroom, and looked out of the window. But he was no longer there. In fact, he had followed her upstairs and was now behind her. He put a knife to her throat and ordered her to undress, threatening to kill her children if she did not comply. Jablonski then forced himself upon her at knife point. During the attack, he hit her in the face with the base of the knife, fracturing her orbital bone. He did all of this with an 8-month-old baby in the room. Jablonski told Marcia that he didn't know what he was doing, but he had started now and that she could identify him. The dog outside was barking, and Jablonski told Marcia to go and get the dog, but that if she did not return, he would kill her kids. Instead of grabbing the dog, Marcia ran straight out of the door to the neighbor's house. The neighbor grabbed their gun and ran back over and caught Jablonski trying to flee. The neighbor aimed the gun and held him at the house until the police arrived. Jablonski was arrested, charged, and sent to prison for this offense. Whilst in prison, Jablonski became pen pals with a woman known as Mary M. This was through a letter-writing program she participated in with her local prayer group, where they wrote to prisoners. Jablonski and Mary corresponded over his time in prison, and when he was released, he convinced her to come and visit him. After some convincing, she reluctantly agreed, but she made it clear they would not begin a relationship of any kind. Mary stayed at his home for a number of days. On the third day of her visit, Jablonski told her that because she had been so sincere about helping him, he was going to be honest with her. Jablonski told her that a week before she arrived, he had dug a grave for her, and even offered to show it to her if she wished. Mary declined. Jablonski said that he had planned to kill her, but because of how nice she was, he couldn't go through with his plan. On the fourth day of her visit, he came into her room as she slept and woke her up. Jablonski asked her if she would like to have sex with him, to which she declined. After some back and forth, she agreed to be tied up with knitting yarn, thinking she could break free if she needed to. Once Mary was tied up, Jablonski left the room to grab a razor. On his return, Mary thought he was going to kill her. Instead, Jablonski shaved her pubic area and photographed it. He then let her go, and the very next day, Mary left. Jablonski's actions started to get worse after this, and in February of 1977, he met a woman named Linda Kimball. The two became serious very quickly. They married and were soon living together and had a daughter. Linda's mother, Isabel, lived nearby, and on the 6th of July 1978, she was awakened to Jablonski on top of her, wearing only his boxer briefs and holding a knife to her throat. Jablonski told her that he had come to force himself upon her, but that he could not go through with it because all he could see was Linda's face. Isabel was able to escape to a neighbor's house, but did not report the incident to the police for Linda's sake. But when Linda found out, she left Jablonski and took their child and moved in with Isabel. On the 16th of July 1977, at 11 a.m., Linda had to go back to the apartment that she shared with Jablonski and pick up some items for the baby. But tragically, Jablonski was there waiting for her. That afternoon, police found her body in the apartment. She had been bound, beaten, stabbed, and strangled with a belt. The cause of death was asphyxiation. At the crime scene, the police found a note in Jablonski's handwriting that read, "Killed to date, common law wife. I told her she would never raise Megan alone or leave me alive. She begged me not to kill her. You screamed, but it was cut short." This was Jablonski's first murder, and he was arrested 11 days later in Arizona. At the trial, Jablonski was deemed mentally unwell and was only sentenced to 12 years for the murder of Linda. Whilst in prison, Jablonski put a personal ad in a newspaper asking for pen pals. The advert that was in the paper will be on screen now if you wish to read it. A woman named Carol Spadoni answered the ad and began to correspond with Jablonski. Carol lived with her mother Eva Peterson in Burlingame, California. By 1982, Carol and Jablonski were married, but not long after this, Carol wanted to end their relationship as she told a friend that he was weird and that she was scared of him. In July of 1985, Jablonski was expecting a visit from his parents and Carol, only to find that Carol had not come. This enraged Jablonski so much that he grabbed his mother, choked her with a shoelace, and covered her mouth. Thankfully, she managed to shout for help, and her husband and guards came to her rescue. In 1990, not far from Jablonski's scheduled release, Carol contacted a man named Richard Muniz. Richard Muniz was a friend of Jablonski and a former cellmate. Carol asked Richard if she could take Jablonski's belongings, as she didn't want to see him when he was released, and Richard obliged. Around the same time, she contacted Jablonski's parole officer. He informed Carol that Jablonski wanted to live with her on his release. She told the parole officer that she did not want him living with her as she feared for her life. Jablonski was released in September of 1990 and was picked up by his friend Richard Muniz. Jablonski stayed with him for the weekend whilst collecting his belongings given to him by Carol. After this, he met with his parole officer and he was informed of the rules of his parole. He was not allowed to travel more than 50 miles and was not allowed to go to Carol's home under any circumstances. Jablonski was not happy about this. He stayed with his friend Richard and complained that Carol was being influenced by her mother and that she was interfering with their relationship. Jablonski later enrolled at a community college to study automotive classes. This is where he met Jim Lawrence, who later testified in court saying that Jablonski was an intelligent man and had also begun recording classes on his tape recorder. On the 18th of April 1991, Jim sold Jablonski a revolver, not knowing anything about his past and that he was forbidden from possessing weapons. On the 22nd of April, Jablonski was seen leaving college with Fatima Van, and she was never seen alive again. This was the start of a wild few days for Jablonski. On the 24th of April 1991, a friend of Carol and her mother Eva Peterson was concerned, as they had not heard from Carol or Eva for some time. This friend went to their house to see if they were okay. When they arrived, their concerns grew, as there were a few days' worth of newspapers in front of the house, and round the back of the house was a cage containing cats. It seemed that the cats had not received any food or water for some time. Worried for Eva and Carol, the friend phoned the police. Police officer Frank Pickens arrived at the house at 7:20 a.m. and heard dogs barking inside. There appeared to be no forced entry into the house, but the door from the garage into the kitchen was open. The police then entered the home and found the body of a second and third victim. The first body was that of Eva Peterson. Eva was naked from her waist down, and her top had been pulled up. A towel had been folded over and pushed into her mouth, and a bullet had been shot through the towel. Above her right breast was another bullet hole and a stab wound to her neck. There were also slashes to her nipples and eyes. A blood smear in the kitchen said she had been dragged along the floor. The stab wound to her throat had been made whilst she was still alive. The cause of death was the gunshot wound to her head and chest. The second victim was Carol Spadoni. Her body was found in the living room, dressed in a nightgown. Duct tape had been wrapped around the nose and mouth of Carol. It was so tight that it would have stopped her from breathing, but Jablonski had stabbed her in the throat, and this created a hole that she could breathe through. Carol had a bullet wound behind her right ear and 3 stab wounds to her abdomen. Half of her right breast was sliced off, exposing a silicone implant. From the results of a laceration, her intestines were protruding from her anus, and she had been repeatedly stabbed in her genitals. The police found a letter addressed to Miss Carol Jablonski, and Jablonski was now their main suspect and was on the run. He was later arrested in Kansas on the 28th of April 1991. He was found with a wallet containing money, Eva Peterson's bank cards, and a small notebook containing the names of Eva and Carol. Written next to the names was Death, April the 23rd, 1991. A search of his car found a .22 caliber revolver with bullets matching those coming from the victims' bodies. Duct tape used on Carol was also found, along with a belt which had written on the inside the names and death dates of his victims. The police also found a tape recorder, and on one of the tapes he talks about the murders in detail, from stalking them to the actual murder. The tape also narrated how he had shot his final victim, an elderly woman working at a truck stop. This was right after he had killed Eva and Carol. The victim's name was Margie Rogers. Her body was found on the 27th of April at the convenience gas station that she worked at. Margie had been shot twice in the head. Jablonski was convicted of the murder of 4 women and sentenced to death on August the 12th, 1994. He died on the 27th of December, 2019, at the age of 73. And now I shall pass you over to a friend and one of my favorite YouTubers, Mike from Bizarre Bazaar.
Hello everyone, and thanks for having me back, Dee. I wanted to show you all this letter I received 2 months before Jablonski died, but I have to warn you, it's written to offend, and it's absolutely vile. He starts off by telling me this: Dear Mike, I got your first letter and don't want to write to you, because I've been put off by different groups in the UK. Plus, it feels it wouldn't give me any positive to use a PO box in the States, because I usually write very long letters. To start, it's so difficult to read. I had to get a friend of mine to help me transcribe it, and it took ages. I'm not sure if it's fantasy or if these things really happened, but I think it's a mixture of both. But it's just so offensive. When I'm going through this letter, there are some things I'll have to just skip past, as it's too offensive to read aloud. I am 73 years old, been on death row for 24 years now. At the present time, there is a moratorium on the death penalty in California. I have no remorse for all my victims. I have murdered, raped and molested. I am the predator and the victims are my prey. I am on death row for the murder of a college co-ed. I classify the was excellent prey. Also, I'm on death row for the murder of my ugly wife Carol and my gorgeous, huge-breasted mother-in-law Eva. I classify Carol was useless prey. Eva I classify was excellent prey. It's sickening how he rates his victims. I've never heard of a killer doing this before. He continues to talk about Fatima, the souvenir I liked from my female prey, with Asperger's, I took her nipples and ears and eyes. Carved I love Jesus on the slut's back. One of my psychologists wrote in my file, I am like a fisherman and I bite the hook where I land my prey. They find out they are in bed with the devil. Another psychologist said, I have an unnatural way of seeing young children in my life and molest them. I was raised by an alcoholic father whose hobby was beating his wife and kids. When I was molested, so too was my cousin when I told him, and he comfort them. They tell him I laughed and got nervous. Painful. It's interesting how he says these vile things and then continues to give us some kind of reasoning as to why he did it. An explanation that nobody asked for, but he felt the need. I have a fetish for diaper commercials on TV, especially a female infant. I love when they are sleeping up them ends, lying on their back, legs spread wide open, showing off their treasure between their legs. This letter's just too vile. I'm going to read a few more lines so you get a gist of what's being said, and then I'm going to just leave it there. So no one would hear the sisters scream. I would adjust the voltage. Pose them exotic poses. It was time for April to experience her worst nightmare. I am heaven and fear. I think he forgot that he didn't want to write me. I think once he got going, he enjoyed it and went on a 32-page spree. I don't think there'll ever be a right time to air this letter in full, as it's just line after line of the worst stuff I've ever read. Fitting to be the final testament of a serial killer who died shortly after writing this. Good riddance.
February 1990, Talana was at a bar called the Parkview Grill, which was owned by her friend Wanda Whiteley. Talana and Wanda were discussing ideas for refurbishing the bar. Talana would do the odd job for those that she knew, and she would be helping to plan and carry out the refurbishment free of charge. With them also was Heidi Crossley, who was Wanda's partner. Not too far from where the three women were sitting was a 33-year-old man named Ronald Sheldon Thomas. Ronald was a long-distance truck driver and had stopped off at the Parkview bar to have a few beers. Whilst he was drinking alone, he noticed three women talking and joined in on the conversation. The four got along well and began chatting and playing pool together. The women saw Ronald's truck parked outside. He tossed them his keys and told them they were welcome to go and check it out. They returned and they continued drinking and chatting. Then it came time for the bar to close up, but Talana, Wanda, Heidi and Ronald wanted to continue their night a little longer. At around 2 AM, they all decided to go and get some late-night fast food together. Only a couple of miles away was a Hardee's restaurant and would be open at that time. Talana turned to Ronald and told him that she had never ridden in a tractor-trailer truck before and asked if he would mind if she got a ride with him to the restaurant. Ronald told Talana that she would be welcome to join him on the journey there. Wanda was just finishing up closing the bar and told the three of them that she would set off in 20 minutes and meet them at the Hardee's. Talana and Ronald got into the truck and left, and Heidi followed behind. But Heidi had to quickly stop off at her house first. So she turned off towards her house as Talana and Ronald drove on to the restaurant. After Heidi did what she needed to do at her house, she made her way back to the Hardee's. But when she pulled up, the truck and Talana and Ronald were nowhere to be seen. Feeling tired, she simply got back into her car, drove home, and went to sleep. Soon after Heidi drove home, Wanda had finished closing up the bar. She set off, drove to Hardee's, but no one was there. Worried for her friend, she began desperately searching for the truck, driving around the local area until the early hours of the morning, but her search proved to be unsuccessful. Wanda then recalled that when all four of them were chatting together, Ronald had mentioned that the load he was carrying in his truck was to be delivered to John T. Hoggard School in the morning. So, on the morning of the 22nd of February, Wanda made a call to the school and asked if she could speak to a delivery man, and the phone was passed over to Ronald. Wanda then asked if she was speaking to Ronald. Ronald replied and told her that she was indeed speaking to him. She then asked where Talana was and where she went after leaving the Parkview bar. Ronald replied, stating that he had no idea who Talana was and claimed that he had never even been to the Parkview bar. He then told Wanda he had no idea who she was either and then hung up the phone. Knowing that he was lying, Wanda went to the school and looked at the order sheet for the delivery. She was able to find Ronald's full name and the trucking company that he worked for. Realizing that he would soon be caught, Ronald decided to confess. On the same day, the 22nd of February, Ronald made a call to his minister and told them that he needed some help because he had done something truly terrible. The minister assured Ronald that whatever he had done, God would forgive him. Ronald then told the minister that he didn't believe the Lord would forgive him and explained that he had beaten and killed an innocent woman. The minister told Ronald that he would meet with him and talk about it, but said that if they were to meet, he would have to bring along a police officer. Ronald agreed and met with the officers and the minister. Ronald explained that he had dragged a woman into a wooded area and beaten her. He told the officer that he had the woman's clothing in his truck and passed the garments over to the officer. Inside the pockets was a driver's license that belonged to Talana Krieger. The reason he gave for doing this to Talana was because she started mouthing off and reminded him of his ex-wife. He told the officer that he and Talana had begun arguing about homosexuality. This was because Talana was a lesbian. While the two were arguing, Ronald pulled up in a car park and in anger began to beat Talana, and that when he saw blood coming from her face, it only angered him further and he beat her more. He then said that he dragged her from the truck into a wooded area and left the scene. But it would soon transpire that Ronald had left out some rather gruesome details. He told the investigators now working on the case where exactly they could find the body of Talana, and so a team went into the wooded area that he said he dragged Talana into to go and find her. On the same day, at 2 p.m, Talana's body was found. It was clear to the investigators upon seeing her that she had passed away. Her body was pale and blood splatters were found nearby. But then, officers nearby noticed that some of Talana's internal organs were hanging out of her body. This had not just been a beating like Ronald had initially claimed. Talana's friend Heidi was brought in and asked to identify Talana's body. But because she had been so badly beaten, Heidi at first couldn't even tell if the body was that of her friend. It was only when she looked for and found a distinct mole on Talana's body that she was able to confirm her identity. Upon realizing the state of Talana's body, investigators began to grill Ronald and told him to explain exactly what had happened. Ronald explained how the four of them were drinking at the bar, and that after, he and Talana headed to the restaurant in his truck. Ronald's passenger seat was taken up by tools, so Talana was sitting in the sleeper part of the truck. Along the way, he asked Talana why she and her friends were lesbians. An argument occurred and Ronald pulled over. He then told investigators that he questioned Talana if a man had ever satisfied her. As he asked this question, he reached over and grabbed her breasts. Talana instinctively responded by slapping Ronald. After being slapped, Ronald then began to punch Talana. This resulted in her falling further back into the sleeper part of the truck. Ronald then came towards her. Talana then said to Ronald, "I know what you're going to do to me. It's happened to me before," and began to take off her clothing. As she was taking off her clothing, Ronald began punching Talana in the head and face. He also started biting her body and breasts, causing them to bleed. Ronald then reached for lubricant that he had in his truck, smothered it on his hands, and inserted his fist into Talana's genitals. Ronald then claimed that blood began to come out from that area, so he stopped. Talana panicked and told Ronald that she desperately needed to urinate, and so Ronald let her go. She opened the passenger side door, but as soon as she stepped out, she collapsed. Ronald got out of the truck and round to the passenger side. He grabbed Talana's arms and dragged her 120 feet into the woods. Talana then said to him, "Leave me alone and let me die." And so he did. Ronald walked back to his truck and made the delivery to the school, where he would soon speak with Wanda on the phone. After he finished the delivery, Ronald cleaned up his truck and went to sleep. When he woke up, he called the minister. Talana's body was taken away and an autopsy was soon conducted. They looked to find out how Talana had been disemboweled, and this is when things become truly disturbing. Ronald told the police that he stopped when he saw blood on his hands, but this wasn't true. The area between Talana's genitals and anus was torn, creating a large opening. Ronald had reached further and grabbed Talana's intestine. Approximately 20 inches of her small intestine was hanging from between her legs where the opening was. Talana's kidney had also been pulled from the inside. Her kidney was still inside her body, but was in a different position from where it should have been. This injury resulted in massive blood loss. So, what really happened was, Ronald had caused the tear with his hands, reached inside Talana's body, pulled on her internal organs, and then dragged her into the woods to die. Talana would have been conscious for around 10 to 20 minutes. Ronald was arrested and charged with the murder of Talana. Because of Talana's sexuality, the local churches and funeral homes in the local area refused to take her body and refused to give her a proper burial. The police also disgustingly stated that Talana put herself in danger by being open about who she was, saying that it was not in her best interest to make that visible to people, and the trial would soon begin. His defense leaned on the fact that he was intoxicated at the time, stating that he had consumed a whole 10 beers that night. His legal team also pushed for an insanity defense, which was ultimately rejected. After a 2-week trial in early 1991, Ronald was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 life sentences with a minimum of 40 years to be eligible for parole. The case of Talana Krieger is an incredibly tragic one, which was made worse by the refusal of the churches and funeral homes to bury her. But due to their refusal, many of Talana's friends would get together to honour their friend and became involved in the 1992 founding of St. Jude's Metropolitan Community Church. The church was the first in the area to openly accept people of the LGBT community to be buried there. This case takes place in the Florida Dade Correctional Institution on the 23rd of June, 2012. Darren Rainey was a 50-year-old man who was serving time in the Florida Correctional Facility. It was in August of 2011 that Darren was sentenced and was given a 2-year sentence for a minor non-violent illegal substance charge. Darren was seen as a decent inmate who didn't cause too much trouble. He was a religious man who would often sit in his cell and read his Quran. Although Darren was suffering with chronic and severe mental health issues, notably schizophrenia. He was prone to having episodes but was taking some medication to counteract them. As a result of his condition, Darren was held in the inpatient care unit and was kept under supervision. Darren was going to be released in July of 2012, but unfortunately, this would never happen. In June of 2012, prison guards took Darren's Quran from him and they threw it away. This caused Darren's mental health to decline and he became increasingly irritated. Many of the guards noted that after this incident occurred, his behavior changed. On the 23rd of June at 7:30 p.m., Darren was in his cell. A correctional officer named Ronald Clark came by to check on him. He found Darren smearing feces all over his cell and body. Ronald reported this to his senior, Sergeant John Fanfan, who instructed Ronald to take Darren to the showers so he could clean himself before bed. Here on the CCTV, we can see Ronald escorting Darren to the showers. One of the showers on the second floor of the inpatient unit was altered and allowed the correctional officers to control the water and the water temperature on the outside. The taps were located in the janitor's closet next to the shower room, not the shower itself. The shower was 3 foot by 9 foot in size. Officers could control the temperature so the water could be either scalding hot or ice cold. Instead of following procedure, Ronald escorted Darren past 2 shower units to the altered one on the second floor. He was released from his handcuffs and told to thoroughly clean himself. He was then locked in the shower. Showers on the inpatient unit at this facility are single-person cells that are locked from the outside. Once placed inside, inmates cannot leave the shower unless released by the officers. Ronald then went to grab some soap from one of the inmates, a man named Harold Hamstead. He returned and passed the soap to Darren. Darren would remark that he did not want to clean himself. According to Ronald, he didn't acknowledge what was said. He locked Darren in the shower, turned on the water, and left. 2 hours later, at 9:30 p.m., Sergeant Fanfan decided that it was time to remove Darren from the shower. Ronald was ordered to make his way there. He turned off the water from the outside and opened the door to find Darren lying face up unconscious. He shouted for some help and prison guards checked his pulse and realized that Darren was no longer breathing. CPR was attempted, but to no avail. Ronald, along with another correctional officer, Cornelius Thompson, picked Darren's body up and brought him over to a stretcher. As they were doing this, they noticed how Darren's skin began to loosen, peel, and was coming off in clumps. His body appeared to be extremely burned. Darren was carried on the stretcher over to the prison's medical center and given some medical treatment, but their efforts proved to be unsuccessful. Darren was pronounced dead at 10:07 p.m. So, what exactly happened? The following day, on the 24th of June, the MDPD crime scene unit arrived at the facility to conduct an investigation as to how Darren died under their supervision. The correctional officers were questioned and they gave their version of events, which is the story I have told so far. Photographs were taken of Darren's body and these images are available online. But be warned, they are incredibly easy to find. Even searching his name can bring them up. If you are squeamish, be careful when searching, as the images are incredibly distressing. The investigators noted that it seemed that Darren's body had suffered serious burns whilst in the shower. Skin was peeling off from his arms, legs, back, face, and chest. Later that day, an autopsy was conducted. The chief medical examiner, Dr. Emma Liu, stated that she was not able to conclude what the cause of death was. But this is when things get very strange, at least in my opinion. Dr. Liu told the investigators working on the case that there were no burns on Darren's body. If you're not squeamish, now would be a good time to look at the images of Darren after he was found in the shower. If you do not wish to Google these images, then I shall explain. The images showed Darren's lifeless body laid on a medical table, and as I said before, a large amount of skin is peeling from his body. The layers of skin underneath are also extremely red. Although I have absolutely no medical training, it does seem to me that Darren suffered serious burns. Following the ruling that Darren's death was unexplainable, later that year, a report documented that there was not enough evidence to further investigate. Some media outlets reported that Darren had simply died from a heart attack in the shower. Due to the fact that his medication can hinder the regulation of body temperature, and the images of Darren's body had not yet been released to the public, and thus the case of Darren Rainey was forgotten. That was until a number of complaints aimed at the prison guards came to the fore. Inmates at the facility complained that the guards would abuse their power. Many of the prisoners made claims that the officers would punish them with beatings, SA, and in some instances would lock them in the shower on the second floor and turn on the water either ice cold or scalding hot. This was the same shower in which Darren Rainey died in. It was alleged that the shower would be used to break inmates into submission. Julie Brown from the Miami Herald and the Huffington Post began to dig deeper into the case of Darren, and they pushed for answers. Pressure from the media resulted in the MDPD delving back into the case. They began to question some of the people that worked in the prison at the time of Darren's death, and some of the inmates. It turned out in the initial investigation into Darren's death, many of the people were not questioned, and possibly deliberately so. An inmate named Harold Hampstead came forward to testify and give information. He was the one who had logged multiple complaints against the prison, which got the attention of the Miami Herald. Harold is serving a 170-year sentence, and his cell was located below the showers in which Darren died. Harold claimed that he would often see the guards taking inmates into the shower for punishment, and that it was all too common. Harold remembers the night of the 23rd of June 2012. He claims to remember the guards taking Darren to the showers and leaving him there for 2 hours. And while Darren was in there, he was screaming in pain, shouting, "I'm sorry, I can't take this anymore, please let me out." A number of other prisoners also came forward with the same story. They had heard or seen the abuse, and that on the 23rd of June, they too had heard Darren screaming in pain and recall the guards ignoring those pleas for help and compassion. In 2013, an inmate named Mark Joyner sent a letter to a prisoners' rights organization. He wrote, "I witness starvation and other forms of cruelty being used to control or discipline mentally ill patients. One of the methods employed was to place inmates under scalding hot water," and went on to say that this is what killed Darren. He said, "If I'm interviewed, I'll prove to law enforcement that this was intentional." Yet, nothing was done. When the case came to the light again in 2014, Mark was questioned. He stated that he saw Darren being taken to the showers and heard him scream out in pain, complaining that the water was too hot, and begged to be let out. Mark told the investigators that the following morning he was forced to clean the showers in which Darren had been killed in. He recalled seeing chunks of flesh that would have belonged to Darren, and a lot of the inmates recalled hearing Darren screaming in pain that night. Following this, former employees of the prison soon came forward and stated that they too had seen and heard prisoners being tormented. They corroborated the stories that the prisoners had told, and these people were reliable witnesses, being medical and mental health professionals. One of the nurses that had tried to resuscitate Darren claimed that his body had been warm to the touch, and that his body temperature had exceeded 102 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 39 Celsius. The nurses also wrote in their report that Darren had suffered significant burns to his body. This was also backed up by a paramedic who attended the scene, who also claimed that Darren's skin was burnt. Prison officials tested the temperature of the water from the shower where Darren was locked into, and the test concluded that the water could reach temperatures of 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 71 degrees C. This temperature is capable of causing burns. In fact, when they were testing the water, it splashed back on one of the people. They stated the water was hot enough to cause them pain. In 2016, Dr. Emma Lou finally published the finalized version of the autopsy report, and the death of Darren Rainey was ruled as accidental. She put down the cause of death to Darren's medication that he was taking for his mental health issues and his heart disease. Dr. Lou stated that the death of Darren was not due to the correctional officers, and made little mention of his skin, putting the skin slippage down to decomposition and not burns. And then, in 2017, the state attorney Catherine Rundle and her office created a 101-page report. This report backed up that Darren's death was accidental and had nothing to do with the correctional officers. It was in 2017 that the photographs of Darren's body were released to the public. Despite the witnesses and the photographic evidence, the official ruling was that the death was accidental. A number of forensic experts spoke to the Miami Herald about Dr. Lou's findings regarding the autopsy, and they strongly disagreed with her findings. They believe that Darren had indeed been burned. They found her explanation of skin slippage due to decomposition preposterous. In my opinion, the guards did indeed take Darren to that shower to punish him, hence why they walked past 2 showers to that one. This case has to be one of the strangest I have come across, and sadly to this day, no one has been held responsible for what happened to Darren. In fact, a couple of the correctional officers were given promotions. There were 4 officers that were deemed to be responsible for what happened to Darren, and it's stated officially that Sergeant John Fanfan, Cornelius Thompson, Ronald Clark, and Edwina Williams did not act with premeditation, malice, hatred, or evil intent. In 2018, Darren's family received a $4.5 million settlement, which came from the taxpayers. Despite this, the case of Darren Rainey remains accidental. What is so tragic about this case is that Darren was clearly in need of help with his mental health, and instead of getting this help, he was tormented by the correctional officers, and sadly, this is likely the end of the story. In 2013, and this is believed to be what caused his mental health to spiral. Despite a couple of run-ins with the police, Derek was described as a non-violent person. Wanting the best for her son, Patricia helped Derek with his mental health appointments where she could, and would book them for him so she knew he would be getting the help he needed. Derek was also taking medication to combat his issues. Those that knew the mother and son
The word dungeon is derived from the French term donjon, which
Royalty 101.
The word dungeon is derived from the French term donjon, which refers to the great keep or central tower of a castle rather than an underground prison. The French word for dungeon is actually cachot. This central keep or donjon was usually the strongest structure in a medieval castle. Surrounded by thick stone walls, these keeps had few windows, making them the perfect place for a prison. During the 11th century, early castle keeps were usually square in shape. But the 12th century saw the use of battering rams and the damage that they could inflict on a castle, which led to round towers being built. A round structure was harder to damage. Being the most secure part of the castle in the early Middle Ages, the Great Keep was where the lord and his entourage would lodge and was the perfect place for them to take refuge if the rest of the castle was overrun by enemy forces. But eventually this central structure became the ideal stronghold for the security of valuable items or important captives. Eventually the word dungeon came to mean any type of jail within the confines of a castle. But it was mainly used to describe those that were underground, and although not originally built for this purpose, these basement areas did make perfect prisons. During the early medieval era, imprisonment was not really a thing. It was more common to either fine, mutilate, or execute criminals. But in turbulent times of war, it was often necessary to hold political prisoners who could be used for negotiation and inducement. Even so, only the most high-level captives would actually be held hostage for long periods of time. Incarcerating common criminals was just not worth the effort or the expense. Today we're going to be traveling back in time and learning about the oubliette, a medieval torture of unspeakable horror. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The dungeon. Built in the 9th century, the once magnificent Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, England, is infamous for its enormous system of oppressive dungeons. The castle has seen its fair share of violence throughout its history. In 1311, King Edward II held his cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and 20 other rebels in the dungeons before their executions. Then in 1399, after surrendering to Henry Bolingbroke, Richard II was secretly moved north from the Tower of London to Pontefract Castle. It is thought that he was imprisoned in the tiny dungeon beneath the keep. There, shut away in the cold, damp darkness, historians believe that Richard was either murdered or left to starve. Regardless of the cause of his death, he died on St. Valentine's Day in the year 1400, aged just 33. Leaving the way clear for Bolingbroke to become King Henry IV. In the later years of the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, leader of the victorious parliamentarians, hated Pontefract Castle because it was the last royalist stronghold to surrender. So he made it his mission to wipe the castle off the face of the earth. To do this, he begged the people of the town of Pontefract to petition Parliament for the castle's destruction. The locals were more than happy to support Cromwell's plans. For them, it was nothing but a reminder of the many times that the town of Pontefract had been plundered by soldiers marching through on their way to the castle. Their houses robbed, their men killed, and their women raped. Cromwell's petitioning was successful, and work began on the castle's destruction in 1649. The ruins of Pontefract Castle can still be seen today, and behind what remains of the castle's once magnificent curtain wall, some 35 feet below ground, lay its dark and depressing dungeons. Originally a monastery, Chillingham Castle was ideally placed on the border between the two feuding nations of Scotland and England. In 1246, the manor house was given to the Grey family by Henry III. In 1344, King Edward III gave orders for the castle to be upgraded, and it was turned into a fortress, complete with battlements, a torture chamber, and dungeons. The merciless Hammer of the Scots, King Edward I, used Chillingham dungeons to imprison his captives, who were horribly tortured. Not just Scottish soldiers and spies, but also women and children. Many had their arms and legs broken before being dropped 20 feet through a trapdoor to the dungeon below. With just one tiny arrow slit of light penetrating the thick walls, the poor prisoners were then left to starve, becoming so desperate that some resorted to eating their own flesh. It is said that 7,500 Scottish prisoners died at Chillingham, and their bodies were dumped into the lake. The bottle. Originally built in the late 12th century, St Andrew's Castle stands on the coast in Fife, Scotland. During the Scottish Wars of Independence, it changed hands several times between the Scots and the English under the rule of King Edward I. In the northwest corner of the castle is a sea tower that served as a prison when the castle was functional. The higher floors would have been used as a guest accommodation, as well as to imprison nobles and keep them under house arrest. On the ground floor there were two chambers, the first being a small room with a narrow ventilation slit in the eastern wall, but it was the second room that contained the notorious bottle dungeon. Cut out of the solid rock, the chamber is 24 feet deep, wide at the bottom and narrow at the top, with no windows and no ventilation. Essentially, prisoners were lowered into this pit and left to rot. One poor soul who was imprisoned there in 1402 was David Stewart, Duke of Rothesay, who was heir to the Scottish throne. However, he didn't die there. Instead, he was transferred to another dungeon, this time at Falkland Palace, where he was left to starve to death. Murdoch Stewart, Duke of Albany, was also held in the St Andrew's Castle dungeons before his execution for treason at Stirling Castle in 1425. Sadly, the first Archbishop of St Andrews, Patrick Graham, was also held there after he was deemed to be insane. He was confined to Liverton Monastery and died at Loch Leven in 1478. The Oubliette. So it would seem that being imprisoned in the Middle Ages was hardly a pleasant experience. Although these nobles who were held for ransom were given comfortable accommodation and treated quite well, for most people, life in a castle prison was a horrific experience. Violence was part of life for the medievals, and tortures such as broken bones from racking, dislocated fingers from thumbscrews, and branding from red-hot pokers were all accepted forms of punishment. And as if being held in the dungeons and systematically tortured wasn't bad enough, along came a jail cell that could inflict even more torment, such as the oubliette, or forgotten room. Many who were thrown in this brutal pit would never see the light of day again. A prison made from a stone cylindrical hole, the oubliette was a vertical shaft, so tiny that it was probably difficult to turn around, let alone kneel, sit, or lay down. Many were underground, making them a dungeon within a dungeon, meaning that all the water and detritus from everywhere else would seep in, making the hole cold and damp. Lowered down into the shaft by rope, the prisoner would have been forced to stand in the dark, deep pit until they were released, possibly standing on the rotting corpse or bones of the last unfortunate guest. Some prisoners were left there for weeks, as they were periodically thrown a little food and water. For others, the torment lasted only days, as they were left to starve and die. Imagine the psychological terror as the trapdoor above them, too high to reach, closed, and they were plunged into the claustrophobic and dank-smelling blackness, standing in fetid water with only rats for company. The name of this horrific jail is derived from the French word oublier, which means to forget, and they were used throughout the Middle East and Europe. The Bastille in France was notorious for its use of oubliettes, as was the Rumeli Hisari in what is now modern Turkey. The medieval French fortress known as the Bastille was built to defend the city of Paris from English attack during the 100 Years' War. King Charles V of France expanded the citadel in 1370, adding dungeons beneath its 6 new towers. The Rumeli Hisari, nicknamed Throat Cutter Castle, was built during the mid-15th century on the European side of the Bosporus Strait, in what was then the Byzantine city of Constantinople, and is now called Istanbul. On the 6th level of the tower was a secret doorway which led to a deep hole, deliberately built into the thick stone wall. When an unsuspecting prisoner was pushed through the doorway, he would fall 13 feet to the bottom of a very deep, dark hole. Still alive, but probably very badly injured, he would be left there to rot. Located beneath the White Tower in the fortress of the Tower of London was another tiny cell which measured a mere 4 foot square. This made it impossible for the average adult human to sit, stand, lie down, or find any comfortable position. The cell was given the rather mocking nickname of Little Ease. With no windows, the prisoner was forced to crouch, alone in total darkness and growing agony, sometimes for days, or even weeks at a time, only to be released periodically for interrogation and torture. Guy Fawkes, who was involved in the failed gunpowder plot on November the 5th of 1605, was held inside Little Ease. Usually, noble prisoners were kept under some form of house arrest and would be given chambers, perhaps in the keep, and possibly freedom to roam around the castle at will. If they were thrown into the oubliette, their time there would more than likely be short-lived, as the punishment was used as part of the torture strategy in an effort to extract information. Conwy Castle in Wales was built by our old friend Edward I, who, not satisfied with conquering the Scots, wanted to subjugate the Welsh as well. Conwy was built in the 1280s during the conquest of Wales. Leading off from the Great Hall is Prison Tower. Here there is a chamber which may have been quite comfortable if the prisoner were offered the relief of a chair or bed. But below this is the true dungeon. A 12-foot deep pit that is hewn into the rock, with only one entrance, being the trapdoor above. At Pembroke Castle in 1440, John Wythorn was imprisoned in the oubliette there by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucestershire and Earl of Pembroke. Poor Wythorn was deprived of clothing and given little food. Left in the dark, claustrophobic pit, he became blind and suffered other incurable ills. As if that wasn't bad enough, the oubliette at Leap Castle in Ireland has spikes in the floor just for a little more added suffering. The small dungeon, which is near to the chapel, was originally used for storing valuables. During renovations to the castle carried out in the 1920s, it was reported that workers found the remains of over 150 people. 3 cartloads of skeletons were said to have been removed. Just another reminder of how many oubliettes are out there, and for the medievals, how popular this form of cruel and unusual punishment was. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. We do release a new one every week, so please be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more, and click the little bell icon to be notified. Cheers!
Royalty 101. The Palace Women and Harems.
The word dungeon is derived from the French term donjon, which refers to the great keep or central tower of a castle rather than an underground prison. The French word for dungeon is actually cachot. This central keep or donjon was usually the strongest structure in a medieval castle. Surrounded by thick stone.
You might think of the medieval period as reserved and puritanical. But actually, medieval people had very different and more relaxed attitudes towards obscenity and sex than we do. As a result, in this episode, be prepared to hear a few harsh words and shocking truths.
When you think about the Tower of London and the medieval period more generally, pleasure probably isn't the first thing you think about. There's a couple reasons for this. First, we're taught that the Middle Ages is an unrelentingly grim time. Nothing but plagues, wars, and the church hiding under your bed to make sure that you don't have too much fun. And secondly, it's true that the church didn't want you to have a lot of fun, and a lot of the sources that survive to us from the medieval period specifically come from the Catholic Church. If you as a clergy member have to devote your life to piety and asceticism, you're probably not going to be encouraging your flock to have a lot of fun. In this series, we'll be uncovering the sumptuous world of medieval pleasure. From sex, to booze, to sport. We'll look at how people in the Middle Ages enjoyed themselves, and sometimes each other, starting with everyone's favorite subject, sex.
start our exploration of medieval sex, I've headed to York, because it was one of the most important cities in medieval England. Rivaled only in size by London itself, York is a great place to understand what people were getting up to because, well, with this many people around, someone was having sex.
Because the Middle Ages is so long ago, I mean, the latest part is about 700 years in the past, it's really easy for us to forget that they were normal people, too. We're here in this shambles in York, which is a great way to get a physical idea about the world of medieval pleasure. This would have been a thriving area of commerce, fun, booze, all kinds of options about how to have a fun time. This can help us to understand what it was like for our medieval ancestors when they went out looking for a bit of fun.
I met up with Dr. Kate Lister, an expert in the history of sex, to talk to her about where we might find clues about sex in medieval streets. One street in particular stands out as a testament to what people would get up to when looking for some fun.
So, Kate, you've taken me here to Grape Lane, and that is a kind of secret about what used to happen here, right?
Grape Lane is a contraction of Grap, which this street was originally recorded as being Grap Lane.
So are there other kind of similar names from around the time?
Yeah, there are. So there are grape lanes as original all over Britain. There was definitely one in Southwark, but there's also a record of Cock Lane, Horsmount. There's all kinds of sit-down hoe was one that's recorded as well. Medieval people didn't mess around when it came to naming your streets because you needed to know where to go.
In the medieval period, you got all these literal names about what you can buy there, like Milk Street, Poultry Street, and Grape Street. We tend to think about sex work as being this really modern invention, and not only is it quite a medieval institution, but it's really out in the open.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was as every part of York as much as the Minster and the cobbled streets, and that's true throughout the medieval world. They had a much more, I don't want to say laissez-faire because that's not true. They regulated it and controlled it, usually by zoning, which is what the names were about. So it was restricted to certain areas. Mm-hmm. But it was certainly very prevalent, very visible, whereas in our modern society it's kind of like this sort of open secret that it's kind of hidden away. We certainly don't have streets named after it, but we have areas that you can go to.
We tend to think, attitudes towards sex are always getting more open. How are attitudes towards sex different in the medieval period?
Just like our own time, there's not one distinct attitude. There's many, but you would probably be surprised if you were to go back in time to just how open and everyday this was. And I think the answer for that is because how are you going to make your money? It's a deeply patriarchal world now, let alone back in the Middle Ages. What job are you going to go into where you can make some serious dollar? It's really, really limited. And that doesn't mean that everybody turned to being on the game, but it was an option that you could make a lot of money in a short amount of time. And everybody knew about it as well. The authorities are going to tolerate it, but they need to be able to identify the people selling sex to differentiate them from good people. So you get all kinds of sumptuary laws and rulings, and it's normally things like they have to wear raid or striped hoods. So different things to different cities. Some of them were white and yellow, some of them were black, some of them were purple. In Vienna, they had to wear bells.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like they would literally be like jangling as they approached. But even that, it's horrendous that they're kind of marked out this way, but that often sort of became like a symbol of who they were. So if you're looking at the Viennese sex workers, they were required to wear all this stuff, and then they kind of made it like kitsch and sexy, like they had these sort of great big poulant, like stiletto shoe platform things, and then it became something that the high class ladies started to imitate them. So as ever, they are trendsetters.
This is a great way to look at what ordinary women can do in cities, because you can't just go into a trade. And if you're a poor girl from off of the farm and you want to come to the big city, like this is one of the ways into a really lucrative career.
What are you going to do?
Yeah, there aren't a lot of options.
Right, absolutely. There are family trades that you could go into. There's big industries. I mean, I guess you could become a nun. You could marry. That was like really your goal as a woman. Is when you wanted money, you'd have to marry it, which is sex work one man at a time, really, more than anything else. It's so frustrating because we don't have like the financial records of these women left to us. It's always like whispers and hints and stories and here and there. But there was a lot of money to be made. There absolutely was. And the kind of redemption arc that you see in a lot of medieval saints is testament to that. They generally don't start by going, she was on the game and absolutely hated it. It's generally like she had a really great shoe collection and then she found Christ.
Yeah.
That's kind of...
It busts one of the big myths about the medieval period, which is that people don't bathe.
They did bathe. Let's just put that one to bed. They were as conscious of smelling bad as URI. They just didn't have the means to be having showers, hot showers every single day. But they worked around that by having public bathing and mixed communal bathing as well. So that's, that should also help to dispel the idea that they're quite prudish, because you just go into town and have a bath with your mates. I don't think I've ever had a bath with my mates. But obviously at the heart of that is the sex workers, because that's a really great place to find clients. And you can actually see that embedded in the language. A slang term for sex workers, I think it's contained in the 14th century, was a lavender. That comes from the lavender that was used to fragrance the laundry houses and also the bath houses. That's how common it was. And there was association of laundresses with sex work, poor women who would, supplement their income that way. And the stews, which was another name for the brothel, that's linked directly to the bathhouses as well. Yeah, you'd go and stew in the water and it became known as a brothel. So it's absolutely at the heart of it.
So obviously here we are, place of commercial sex, but it's not like medieval people don't have regular flirtations and trying to get a hold of each other.
God, yeah, absolutely they did.
So I have gathered from Andreas Capellanus's De Amore, or The Art of Courtly Love, several key medieval chat-up lines. And my challenge to you, Kate Lister, is to pick up a fine gentleman on the streets of York using only medieval pickup lines.
Armed with the most refined chat-up lines that courtly love has to offer, Kate was eager to try out her charms on York's unsuspecting suitors.
When the divine being made you, he left nothing undone.
Absolutely. That one's good. That's good. That's a 4 or a 5 for me.
Good 3.5.
I appreciate
A
that.
hit!
Yeah.
Yes! You must know that many days ago I was smitten with the arrow of your love, and that I tried with all my might to conceal the wound.
That's a 5. That's doing it for me, yeah.
I would say it's on top, but not quite.
Okay, all right.
To tell you the truth, I am an ambassador sent to you from the court of love.
Try again, buddy.
No, that's not doing it.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
So much nobility is apparent in you, and you are distinguished by so much courtesy, and believe in your presence. I may say that all those things that are lying in my heart waiting to be said.
4.5 to 5. I really like that. It feels sincere.
Yeah.
Very Valentine's-y.
Very Valentine's-y,
I do
right?
like it.
I'm not running screaming because clearly you don't know who I am if you think that I'm noble and courteous.
The Catholic Church quite literally towered over medieval cities like York, and it served as a constant physical reminder to everyone about how they should live their life in public and in private.
We're here at the York Minster, not just because it's a beautiful building, which it is, but because it's a great way to think about the physical presence that the church had on people's lives in the medieval period. Think about the fact that most people live in a building that's not even higher than 2 stories tall, and then what a huge building like this would mean in your life. So it's a physical reminder of what the church teaches about sexuality, as well as everything else. For medieval Christians, sex was a moral tightrope. Of course, everybody had to have sex, that's how you get children. But the church had long been of the opinion that any sex for anything other than procreation was a no. The church's position is that the only time sex is acceptable is between 2 married people for procreative purposes. And on top of that, there's a lot of other rules as well. No sex on Saturdays and Sundays in case you're too turned on during Mass. Only have sex in the missionary position because anything else subverts the natural relationship between men and women. Don't get fully naked during sex because it's just too exciting. In short, during sex, you should be trying to have the least amount of fun possible. The thing about all these rules, nobody really listened to them.
Perhaps surprisingly to our modern sensibilities, some of the biggest rule breakers could actually be found among the clergy.
We keep mentioning that sex is considered sinful by the Catholic Church. What are the theological reasons for that, you might ask? And there are several. Some of the oldest conceptions about this date to St. Augustine at the end of the antique period. He thinks very, very deeply about sex a lot of the time because he had a bunch of it before he joined the clergy himself. His idea about sex is this. Sex is very sinful because if we still lived in the Garden of Eden, if Adam and Eve hadn't fallen to original sin, when you wanted to have children, you would simply think about it. You would then simply insert tab A to slot B, decide now is the moment for conception, and it would happen. Boom, you got a baby. And you wouldn't feel anything about that at all. It wouldn't feel sexy, it wouldn't feel lustful, it wouldn't be pleasurable. You would only be doing it in order to have a kid. Fast forward to post the fall of man, and everyone is actually turned on when they want to have sex. And that's the thing that makes it sinful. It's absolutely fine to have a baby. The problem is liking the actual act of sex too much. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas then ranks sex in terms of how sinful it is. Sex is more sinful if it is more illogical, in his opinion. The most logical sex is sex between two married people who specifically want a baby. Nothing sinful about that. But it can become sinful if you're too turned on in the process. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas warns you that you shouldn't have too many lascivious kisses. You shouldn't be groping your partner too much. Ideally, you don't actually get naked and you wear some clothing during sex. Then forms of sex are ranked as less logical from there. So things that we don't necessarily consider as quote-unquote real sex, medieval people are actually more interested in. So things like manual sex or oral sex are technically sodomy. Sodomy is defined as any type of sex that cannot result in procreation. And it doesn't matter who is doing it. It doesn't matter if you are married to your wife and you're engaging in these acts. If it can't lead to a baby, then it's sinful. All of this is directly tied up with the idea that in the Garden of Eden, you wouldn't have any fun. So what is sinful about sex? Purely pleasure.
But, as we've already mentioned, not even the clergy always followed their own rules about sex. Some of my favorite references to the clergy behaving badly come from 14th century Prague.
There's a great document called the Archdiaconate Protocol where basically the church goes door to door to every church and asks parishioners, do you have any problems? And a lot of the parishioners in Prague say that they have problems specifically with sex and their priests. What kind of problems? Well, we've got priests who are living openly with concubines. There's one priest who is operating a brothel out of his own house that includes about 4 different women. There's a priest who sees a sex worker very, very regularly. And when he's confronted about it by the church, he says, well, yes, I see a sex worker, but I always pay her right away and make her leave immediately after. But probably my very favorite priest from Prague is one who gets caught in a brothel and wants to run away before he gets arrested. So he lights out of the house completely naked and runs down the streets of Prague where all his parishioners see him. Imagine you're getting a lecture from the pulpit on a Sunday about all the sex you shouldn't be having, and you're getting it from the guy who you saw naked last night. These are the reasons why it makes it clear that nobody really necessarily cares what the church has to say about sex. If priests themselves can't follow the rules, why are the day-to-day lay members going to care?
If we want to get a better idea of people's sex life in the medieval period, it's helpful to have a look at some of the places that they would have been expected to do the deed. Because the bedrooms of everyday people during this period weren't exactly comfortable, and they certainly weren't private.
So one of the things that we need to know, first of all, is although there's just one bed here with us, in a servant's room that almost certainly wouldn't have been single occupancy, you would be sharing it. I guess sex was almost a public affair in the Middle Ages. Privacy would be a really, really rare commodity.
So say you have a dorm like this, probably, you're not going to be on the pole trying to bring a girl back to this sort of a situation, but it's not exactly unheard of either, is it?
Well, I mean, look, where are you going to go? Like, what are your options, right? There's nowhere to be hanging a tie on the door to say, don't come back. You're either going to take the chance and do it in shared rooms, or you're going to have to try and find sex outdoors, I suppose, or a quiet area somewhere.
And And in a city like York, that's probably going to be a bit hard to come by.
It's going to be tricky. I mean, you find dark corners all over the place, but quiet, maybe not so much. So I suppose, yeah, you would be used to people having sex around you. Not constantly, but I mean, if you're growing up in a home, and like where families were sharing one room, probably growing up and heard your parents have sex.
One of my favorite documents from the medieval period that talks about sex comes from a penitential, which is, a guidebook for priests to ask people in confession, have you done these bad sins? It's written by Bouchard of Worms. He's a bishop. He lives in the 8th century. He says that you should ask women, have you ever made an object in the shape and size to match your carnal desire? And have you ever taken the object, fastened it about your waist, and used it on another woman? So basically, have you ever made a dildo? And have you turned it into a strap-on and used it with other women?
See, you've just got to know where to look for this stuff. It's there.
Actual sexual objects or apparatuses left over from the medieval period are extremely rare. And this makes a lot of sense. By their very nature, these are the sorts of objects that are secretive, and they aren't exactly passed down from person to person. However, there are other resources that we can look at that might tell us more about medieval people's sex lives.
So we don't really have medieval objects, but we definitely do have medieval images of sex, right?
Someone had to have thought that it was worth saving to survive, basically. So we do have evidence of sex in like medieval manuscripts, for example, especially in the marginalia, the kind of little doodles.
Of course,
the slutty doodles all around the side, which has perplexed scholars ever since they were written. It's like, this is a really, really holy book, and here is a picture of women putting penises in a tree.
I love it.
Why is that doing that thing? We don't know, but that's good evidence. We also have surviving badges from pilgrimages.
Oh, I love pilgrim badges. A lot of them are sort of late medieval 15th century. They come from the lowlands. I've got a very, very favorite one, and it is a vulva that is wearing a crown, and she is being carried on a little litter by 3 phalluses who all have little legs and a tail.
Where did you go to get that badge? Wherever it was.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? Because it shows us all kinds of different ways of relating to pilgrimage and the sex that you might be having on it. Because you might be having a lot of sex when you're on pilgrimage because you're under plenary indulgence. So that means that like any sins that you're doing, such as having sex, will be forgiven. Or it might mean that people are hoping to, for example, cure something like impotence, or they're really hoping for fertility, and that's why they're going on holiday. But it certainly shows us that medieval people have this real sense of humor about sex, where they don't mind kind of showing off their interest in it.
Yeah, I know it's really difficult for us to look back and say this was exactly that, because we don't have the context, but I can't look at those items and not think that there was humor in it. That they thought that was funny, that was something that they're playing about with it, even if it had a wider significance, like fertility. It was definitely, they're having fun with it, definitely.
My big joke about being a sex historian is that I gossip about dead people's sex lives. So in that vein, what is your favorite piece of gossip about a dead person's sex life?
Since we're in York, there is one story that I remember about a man in York, and I think it was the 13th century, his name was John, and he was subjected to an impotence test by the church. This goes back to a medieval custom that you could have your marriage annulled if things weren't working in the bedroom on the grounds of annulment. Because the church is like, well, that's what marriage is for, right? It's to produce and procreate, and if things aren't working, then you can have it annulled. But the church also doesn't like to just hand out annulments. Of
course.
Because if you just didn't like your husband, you could go, sorry, it's not
working.
It's not working for me, and then go off. So they came up with this idea that you had to prove it. How do you prove impotence? So that involved a custom known as congress, where wise matrons of the town would be instructed to try and rouse this poor guy's member to see if the charges of impotence were actually correct. And poor old John from York, he was subject to this by several wise matrons who were told exposed their breasts to him, that rubbed him very greatly, and eventually had to declare his member was utterly useless.
Oh, poor John.
Poor John.
I mean, I can't imagine a more unlikely situation in which you could prove
that things were working.
I know, right? The pressure.
The threat of divorce, a bunch of women you barely know, and you absolutely have to perform in that moment. And now here we are, 800 years later, still making fun of John.
Laughing about John. Oh, John.
Oh, John. Oh. Despite what the church wanted and told people, sex was happening in a variety of ways in the medieval period. Accounts from the time can also tell us a little bit about medieval people's attitudes surrounding gender and sexuality. There was a particularly interesting case in 14th century London, where there were strict laws on where sex workers could carry out their trade.
In 1394, a woman named Eleanor Reichner, a sex worker, is caught up on Cheapside with a client named John Bickley. They're in trouble because they are having sex in the wrong place inside of London city walls. As Eleanor is asked to testify, she says that she ordinarily sees clients here around the Tower of London instead.
But the court record reveals something interesting about Eleanor.
She had originally been called John Reichner at birth, but had been living as a woman for years now. And she primarily worked in commercial sex, both in London and also for a time in Oxfordshire. She knew about the ins and outs of commercial sex because that's how she made her living. And it wasn't really a problem that she was what we would call trans, or that she was a sex worker. The only thing she was in trouble for was having sex in the wrong place. If she went back to work here by the tower, technically it would be fine. It's only a matter of record with the courts because of where she was having sex. We don't know exactly what happened to Eleanor as a result of all of this, but her story is proof that what we would call queer people now existed in medieval London just as much as they do today, and they were having sex.
To our way of thinking, sex in the medieval period for the everyday person wasn't exactly a relaxing affair. If you weren't out in the open, you were in a cramped and often crowded communal room. But what if you were lucky enough to be from the upper classes of society? Well, in the Tower of London, we have a fantastic recreation of a bedroom to give us an idea of what the private or not so private lives of the royalty were like.
This is one of the finest medieval bedrooms that you were ever likely to see because it is fit for a king. King Edward I, more specifically, who ordered this bedroom built in 1280. It's been redecorated based on manuscript evidence and what we think it might have looked like. Even now, we associate four-poster beds like this with romance and, well, sex. This is an extraordinarily fine example. It's based off of descriptions made for King Edward I. It's a royal bed. So this is as fine as it's possible for a bed to be. Kings would get themselves beds like this, hugely extravagant objects, not just because they were beautiful, but because they afforded them privacy. In a king's bedchamber like this, you wouldn't just expect to find the king and queen. There would often be servants, courtiers going in and out. It would be a throughway. So if you wanted to actually have sex and you wanted some privacy, you'd close these curtains and give yourself some extra space. However, rich people of all types are going to want beds like this if they can afford them. It's just this is the finest example of a medieval bed you're ever likely to see. So how crowded was a royal bedchamber likely to be? Well, it was probably at its max capacity during something called the bedding ceremony that would happen on a royal wedding night. Bedding ceremonies vary across Europe and across time in the medieval period, but in England there were some specifics to it. The first thing that would happen was a priest would come and bless the bed. After that, there would be a big party while the king and queen got into their pajamas and enjoyed some spiced wine. After that, the groomsmen and bridesmaid would put them into the bed and begin throwing stockings at each other. There was a reason for this. Apparently, if you hit the king or queen with your stocking, that meant that you would be the next person to marry. After all of this rowdiness, then the king and queen would, in theory, close the bed curtains and get down to consummating the marriage, which is absolutely essential for a marriage to be considered legitimate. So why are so many people involved in the bedding ceremony, and why do they care if the king and queen are having sex? Well, this is the only way that marriage exists. It's for having heirs and having sex. No sex, no marriage. They absolutely have to have sex on their wedding night in order for the marriage to be legal. This is also a matter of importance for the dynasty as a whole, and every courtier has an interest in that. No kids, no dynasty. That's why you get married. So it might not be the most romantic thing in the world, but it is something that the court's involved in. Your royal sex life. If trying to have sex after the bedding ceremony doesn't sound like a lot of fun to you, that's because royal sex wasn't supposed to be fun. You know what was fun? Courtly love. Courtly love, when we say the word, conjures up ideas of romance, and that's certainly true, but it's a kind of romance that isn't very modern at all. That's because it takes place almost exclusively between married women and the unmarried men in the court's retinue. Unmarried men would write love songs, they would write poetry, they would do anything in theory for the woman of their dreams. And part of that was finding ways to have sex that wouldn't endanger their marriages. So the payoff of courtly love is usually non-procreative types of sex, not in beds, not with your husband, anywhere at court that you can snatch a moment of time. There's a real worry within courtly love literature specifically about endangering your heirs and endangering the line of succession. Therefore, there's also warnings about having procreative sex with the person that you're in love with. For example, in Arthuriana, Guinevere and Lancelot accidentally bring down Camelot when they have procreative sex. Whether or not people actually listen to these warnings is not something that we can actually tell. No one tends to write down, yeah, I had adulterous sex last night. However, we do know that there is some kind of tension there, and there are lines that are being drawn and redrawn all the time about what is acceptable and romantic. So we tend to think about medieval people as being real prudes. However, they're interested in all kinds of sex and romance that we would find completely unacceptable. Even at court, in one of the most important places in England, you'll see people that are breaking rules that we think are written in stone. Doesn't matter what the church thinks. Doesn't matter what even Arthurian literature thinks. People are going to find a way to have some fun with each other one way or another. And usually it means that they're not feeling particularly romantic about their husband or wife when they do it.
If courtly love stories offered a refined way to talk about sex and sexuality, at the other end of the spectrum were all sorts of bawdy and lewd tales that would really offend our own sensibilities. However, these sorts of smut had an almost universal appeal in the medieval period, and individuals from all walks of life would compete to tell lusty puns, dirty stories, and all kinds of jokes in places such as banquets. But first, we need to dress the part. Ta-da!
The banqueting hall it's not just somewhere that you come to get your food. It's kind of the epicenter of the house, the epicenter of culture. There'd be musicians, there might be dances happening, and the one thing that they loved is a story. You had your fair share of real highbrow stuff, courtly love, knights, damsels, and all of that stuff. But there's absolutely no doubt that the medieval people loved a smutty story.
And this is the thing. So, you could be in the richest situation in the world and you're still going to hear something like, for example, Chaucer. One of my favorite stories is The Miller's Tale. Within that, you have someone who, she's married to an older man, and she convinces him that a giant flood has come in order to have sex with their lodger who lives in the house. And it's really, really involved. And then it ends with a fart joke.
Yes, it does. It's a really convoluted, farce, basically, of a young woman trying to have sex with someone who isn't her husband, and then there's another suitor on the scene who's wooing her, and he tries to get her attention by singing under her window while she's in bed with another man, and she thinks it's really funny, so she opens the window and she basically sticks her ass out and says, kiss this, and he does. But the whole joke is the fact that that he kind of leaps back and goes, oh my god, women don't have beards, and that's just hilarious to all the medieval people.
Chaucer does come from a highbrow context. He is kind of a noble. So, this is the sort of conversation that you could expect to have at table. But we don't expect that. And I suppose what it kind of really tells us is that the history of sex and the kind of pleasure of that is not this big straight line forward into being more and more comfortable about sex. Because actually, in a lot of ways, we've come really far backward from being able to have those sorts of conversations openly.
Yeah, I mean, we're better. We are more open than perhaps our grandparents were, but in many ways, we're not open like the medieval people were. We don't have public communal bathing. We don't have sex in the same room as other people. We don't go to a highbrow dinner party and tell pubic hair jokes.
Maybe you don't.
Well, maybe you don't, but it's a pretty sure way not to get invited back pretty quick. But like this is like, you know, the equivalent of having dinner with, you know, like the creme de la creme of society, and you're sitting around, you know, making jokes about asses and sex, and, you know, I would have loved it. But it's like a strange thing to be doing in this kind of really highbrow situation. But yeah, they loved it. It was just part of their humor and their worldview.
So, okay, over this episode, we have established that medieval people really quite randy. Whether that's people from a royal household having sex in the same room as members of their household, whether that is being totally comfortable with pretty raunchy names for streets, totally accepting sex work, or even having sex in public. Because I have got a great poem for you. It is called The Maidservant's Holiday. It's from the 15th century, and it goes thusly. Jack will pay my share on Sunday at the ale fest. Jack will souse well my throat every good holiday. Soon he will take me by the hand, and he will lay me out on the ground so that my buttocks are in the dirt. Upon this high holiday. In he thrust, and out he drew, and ever I lay beneath him. So, I think, you know, other than being quite funny, what this poem also makes really clear is that medieval people really like to mix their pleasures. Sex, that goes with booze. On that note, our next episode is going to be all about alcohol.
Cheers.
If, like me, you're craving a stiff drink after all that smut, you're in luck. In our next episode, we'll be filling your tankard to the brim with every tipple from the Middle Ages. From the Brewsters and pubs of the peasantry to the royal cellars at Hampton Court, I'll even be heading to Wildcard Brewery to try a real medieval beer.
Stop me if you've heard this one before, but size isn't everything. Thinking about beer in the 21st century almost always conjures up the image of students, sport fans, or elderly gents knocking back a few pints to round out their day or start up their night. However, the picture was very different in Britain during the Middle Ages. Modern day beer is, broadly speaking, the evolved descendant of its 19th century ancestors. A standardised product, often light and carbonated, adapted from European valued for its nutritional content. In the Middle Ages, food was neither plentiful nor of good quality, and so beer was
to see what you're bringing in and to make sure that you are paying an appropriate tax in order to put these things on sale. For all intents and purposes now, this is the middle of the city, but for medieval London, you're right at the edge of things. And what that means is you're kind of at the edge of what the city can offer you as well. Oftentimes, you would see that poorer neighborhoods are more distributed towards the outward end of things, whereas the richer bits are right in the middle of town where things can be a little bit safer and a little bit better guarded. One of the interesting things, same properties out themselves.
In the Middle Ages, death was a profoundly important and spiritually significant event. Funerals in medieval Spain featured dramatic displays of public weeping and sorrow, but one practice in particular, favored by women up until the early 13th century, is particularly strange to the eyes of modern observers. Today on Real Crusades History, we'll discuss this practice and try to grasp it from the perspective of the medieval era. The year is 1211. The place, the Kingdom of Castile. In modern-day Spain, King Alfonso VIII's son, Prince Fernando, has just died. Alfonso is inconsolable, and the whole kingdom goes into a state of mourning. Funerary services are held at the royal monastery near Burgos, where the 22-year-old prince's body will be interred. Knights don sackcloth or hair shirts. The elderly sprinkle their heads with ashes. Mourners gathered for the funerary rites weep publicly and display their grief with unreserved sorrow. The king's daughter, Princess Berenguela, assumes the traditionally feminine role of chief mourner and caretaker of the dead. In taking on this role, Berengaila was performing a prestigious function for the royal family. She was in charge of the royal treasury and directed the affairs of the funeral. She also made a dramatic display of the family's grief, weeping openly over her brother's body. She may even have taken part in an age-old display of sorrow that was, by now, dying out in the Iberian Peninsula. At the funeral of Prince Fernando, virgins scratched at their to heal the. To modern observers,
the Palace of Versailles, with all its gilded majesty, still attracts thousands of tourists. People from Germany, Britain, France, and Japan flock to the palace to savor the intimacy of the royals, but also to keenly discover the filth that lies behind the scenes. They've all heard of a stinky Versailles, of members of the court relieving themselves in the corners of stairwells, of a king holding audiences on his throne, a chair with a hole in the seat. Preconception?
They didn't have the same means for cleaning the palace.
Cleanliness was defined by having good breath and feet that didn't smell.
Perfumes came in to mask the lack of cleanliness.
So where did this bad reputation come from? Were the royals really as dirty as their stinky palace?
One very important point to make is each era is convinced it's clean.
Where is the line between fantasy and truth, between dirty and clean, at the Palace of the Sun King? Legend has it that Louis XIV only took one bath in his long life. Is that just another preconception, or was Louis really not a fan of bathing?
There were no bathrooms at the time of Louis XIV, no specific places for washing. People bathed in the river. They could also bathe in their chamber, in which case a copper bathtub would be brought in and filled. But one has to admit it was rare for the king to take a bath.
I'm Alice Loxton, and I present documentaries over on History Hit TV. If you're passionate about all things royal history, sign up to History Hit TV. It's like Netflix, but just for history. You've got hours of ad-free documentaries about all aspects of the past. You can get a huge discount for History Hit TV. Make sure you check out the details in the video description and use the code REALROYALTY, all one word, when you sign up. Now, on with the show.
She will be Empress of France, Josephine, Napoleon Bonaparte's great love.
I'm Alice Loxton. You can get a huge discount for History Hit TV. Make sure you check out the details in the video description and use the code REALROYALTY, all one word, when you sign up. Now, on with the show.
She will be Empress of France, Josephine, Napoleon Bonaparte's great love.
Josephine was one of the women people called the Celestials during the Directory, one of those women who was a hit with the men.
She is the it girl of revolutionary Paris.
There was dancing and drinking everywhere, and of course the more money you had, the more lavish the parties were.
Napoleon Bonaparte sets out to conquer Europe. At his side, the beautiful Josephine. Did she hold his stirrup as he made his way to the French imperial throne?
She is born into a new life with him, an epic, an adventure. She becomes Josephine.
The year is 1796, 7 years after the outbreak of the French Revolution. Everyone in Parisian society knows the beautiful and elegant Viscountess Rose de Beauharnais. The rich and powerful of the time mingle in her salon, but she is destined to become famous under a different name.
Napoleon was the one who started calling her Josephine. He was a romantic, and he gave new names to the women he loved.
The revolutionary's reign of terror has just ended. Tens of thousands die on the scaffolding during this period.
She had barely escaped the guillotine, and she met Napoleon when he was still a relatively unknown figure.
A general, 6 years her younger, at the beginning of his career.
Napoleon Bonaparte falls madly in love with her, besieging her little palace in Rue Chantereine relentlessly, day and night.
During this period, no one could have imagined that the Corsican general would one day write world history.
The Parisians always have their own way of doing things. When an outsider arrives who doesn't really know French, he's automatically viewed as a half-moron. And Napoleon had a Corsican accent and made all of the related mistakes.
The odd couple marry on the 9th of March, 1796. The cosmopolitan woman, charming, elegant, popular, and the small, inconspicuous, awkward military man.
After all, she was a very wasteful woman who liked to spend her money on clothes, jewelry, and other things. She came from the lower nobility, but in the last phase of the revolution, she had very good relations with the inner circles of the revolutionaries. Some people from the nobility played a role in what happened, of course, and that fascinated him.
What is Josephine up to?
She realizes that she's not all that young anymore, that she has 2 children, that she's in financial trouble. She knows that she needs more than just a protector. She needs a husband.
All just cold calculation. She has only known this man a few months. Is she simply taking advantage of his love and passion? What is she thinking?
It's a lightning-fast wedding. She always dreamed of having a devoted husband, and she feels that with him. He's completely in love, makes her laugh, writes beautiful letters. They are among the most beautiful in all of French love literature.
Good God, how I long to be with you tonight, writes the new groom from the front. And Josephine?
She was glad her husband was gone, and she could devote herself to her luxury shopping and so on. And he enjoyed himself on the battlefield and devoured himself with passion for her.
Josephine stays in Paris and devotes herself to what she does best: luxury, men, and love. Jubilee Impériale, that is the name of the French folk festival being celebrated here in September 2017 at Château de Malmaison. It's Josephine's country palace at the gates of Paris. Thousands of visitors come to honor Napoleon and Josephine. They are resurrecting a great era in French history, one in which Napoleon's soldiers carried the ideas of the revolution throughout Europe. Participants in the Jubilee wear dresses of the Directory and the Empire. Scenes from Napoleon and Josephine's lives are reenacted.
I can feel that the people love her. It's unbelievable. 200 years on. She has the same effect on people as Lady Di. She was very popular.
Today, Château de Malmaison is a French national museum. Josephine lives here whenever her schedule allows. She personally selects and buys all of the treasures in the halls and rooms of the chateau.
She loved luxury, her pleasure, she was smart. It was prophesied to her in Martinique that she would become more than just a queen.
Josephine was born Marie-Joseph Rose de Taché de la Pagerie on the Caribbean island of Martinique on the 23rd of June, 1763. Her parents are of lower nobility and own a plantation on the Antilles Island.
Josephine's childhood was not like Scarlett O'Hara's in Gone with the Wind. At the age of 3, everyone has to flee. Her plantation is devastated by a hurricane, and life is marked by brutal slavery. Josephine will never look back on her homeland with nostalgia. She loves the colors, the clothes, the customs, but she will never talk about the island. She won't find herself longing for it.
At the age of 16, Josephine sails from the Antilles to France. She's promised to one Viscount de Beauharnais. One of Josephine's aunts has arranged the marriage.
It's a great match for the Tachers. The Beauharnais are a rich family. Her father immediately gives his blessing to the marriage. She is looking forward to getting to know Paris and the nobles, who she has heard such wonderful stories about. She is happy to leave the remote island on the very edge of the French territory. She is now entering the heart of the ancient regime.
Alexandre de Beauharnais is a young Viscount who comes from an old and highly respected family. Josephine dreams of a life of luxury and splendor, but her marriage to the Viscount will be a disappointment.
Alexander was a beautiful man. He loved women and was incredibly intelligent. But he never really loved Josephine.
Beauharnais was a typical representative of his class. He was a scoundrel, he was a playboy, as we would say these days. He cheated on Josephine right from the start. He gave her 2 children, but otherwise didn't take care of her. He always had girlfriends and affairs with other people's wives, but that was considered normal among the nobility.
He leaves beautiful Josephine alone much of the time. Her son, Eugene, is born in 1781. When their daughter Hortense is born 2 years later, Alexandre is far away in the French overseas colonies.
There he meets one of his former lovers who wants him back. She slanders Josephine, convinces him that Hortense is not his daughter. The couple don't see each other much. How could he have 2 children?
This is not how Josephine had imagined her life. She lives in her in-laws' palace in Paris. Alexandre is mostly traveling, wasting his money. But is she unfaithful to him? Alexandre, at least, is convinced that she is.
When Alexander returns to France, he throws Josephine out. She has to leave the house. That's how the laws worked at that time. But she defends herself, demonstrating her true character. She hires a lawyer, fights against Alexander, uses the law, and manages to prove that she was slandered. She wins the case.
Josephine receives alimony, is allowed to keep her title, continues to live in the palace in Paris, and decides to take care of herself from now on.
She won a fight, and she managed to do a lot. But social life is difficult for her, nevertheless. She can't return to the limelight as the Viscount's wife. Even though she still is a Viscountess, she's excluded from the company of the ancient regime and is never received in Versailles.
Josephine is 27 years old, a beautiful woman, the mother of 2 children, and all alone.
She doesn't stay down for long. One event changes everything. Their lives, France, Europe, the world. The French Revolution.
With the storm on the Bastille in 1789, a hurricane begins sweeping across France. The rule of feudal society is coming to an end, and the monarchy is doomed.
The revolutionaries had no blueprint, no idea what they actually wanted to achieve. They all started out as monarchists. They didn't intend to cut the king's head off. Nobody was dreaming of doing that. Not even a character like Robespierre or any other of the bloodthirsty fellows who then arose had dreamed of regicide. That was ultimately the result of further developments because the king, Louis XVI, was such an idiot. After all, a very important part of the revolution was undertaken by people who belonged to the upper classes.
One of those people is Alexandre de Beauharnais, Josephine's husband.
He's an intelligent man, this womanizer, and he quickly adapts to the new era. On the night of the 4th of August, 1789, he votes for the abolition of the privileges of the nobility. And Josephine benefits from her husband's new role, even though he isn't her husband anymore.
Josephine begins to bask in the glory associated with the name Beauharnais.
Josephine is not a politician with a program. She's a networker. She wants influence. One could say that she lives through the gaze of others, her influence on others, and she tries to expand that influence in all directions. But the problem is that the revolution is progressing. During the Reign of Terror, it was not advisable to have moved in all social circles. That will be her downfall, and will even land her in prison.
Gradually, the radicals are gaining ground. Ludwig and Marie Antoinette will die on the guillotine. France's bloodiest months are beginning. 17,000 people will be executed in the course of a year and a half.
The Reign of Terror was such that everyone who was suspected of anything at all was sent to the guillotine. Among them was Beauharnais, who had sat on his country estate and hadn't budged.
His service to the revolution no longer matters.
Her husband Alexander is arrested for outrageously petty reasons. They want to make an example of him. He is arrested very soon after the beginning of the Reign of Terror. She tries to help him, but she also comes under suspicion. People know that she has friends that are royalists. Ultimately, she is also arrested and sent to the same prison. Soon afterwards, Alexander is beheaded.
By the end of July 1794, Josephine's life hangs by a thread.
One morning, there's a roll call in the prison. It's usually the sign to get on the cart that's headed to the guillotine.